1, 2. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Spanish Armada TIDE International Conference. We're delighted to have you all here. Welcome to Cahir Luck, Michael Clark at the back there, and to all you good people. Welcome to the Spanish Armada TIDE International Conference for the first series of lectures on the Armada and other maritime themes. I'd like to welcome our friends from TIDE, the EU Atlantic Area Project, staff from Sligo County Council, and the many other friends and supporters who have joined with us here this morning. I would ask you to put your mobile phones on silent now. We begin this lecture series with one of the most experienced and renowned marine archaeologists who has worked on the Spanish Armada all his life, including involvement when the Streeter wrecks were first discovered in 1985. He has remained a great friend of Sligo since, is a published author several times over, including his new magnificent work, co-written with Geoffrey Parker, titled Armada. Just a little bit of housekeeping. If anybody needs to use the bathroom, the toilets are on the right-hand side as you go up the corridor. We will be breaking for tea and coffee at 11. So anyway, can I introduce you to Dr. Colin Martin?
I was told to go this way. Thank you very much. The first slide, please. The Great Armada of 1588 and the wrecking of so many of its ships along the western coasts of Scotland and Ireland, some in Norwegian and Spanish waters too, has left an unprecedented legacy of written and archaeological evidence which together open a unique window into the late 16th century. The extensive and meticulous records of the fleet have survived, virtually intact, in files preserved at Simancas and elsewhere. Paula will have much to say about this tomorrow. Next, please. Sorry, that should have been the first slide after the title one. Next, please. To this we can add the archaeological discoveries which, over the past half-century, have been providing a growing corpus of material evidence. The scope is almost limitless for further interdisciplinary study into this momentous historical event, allowing us to access, often in surprising detail, the aspects of its contemporary world. It's advancing our understanding of past events and enriching a heritage common to us all. People along Europe's Atlantic rim are thus drawn together in collaboration and friendship, as this conference is so aptly demonstrating. Next, please. The Armada was essentially an invasion task force, and today I'll touch on its contribution to the study of early modern warfare through what amounts to be a 16th century amphibious army frozen in transit in the archives and on the sea floor. Next, please. I met my first Armada soldier in May 1968 among the wreckage of the Santa Maria de la Rosa at the bottom of Blasket Sound, off Ireland's southwesterly tip. There we found 2 pewter plates inscribed with the name Matute. Documents record that Francisco Ruiz Matute sailed on this ship as captain of a 95-strong infantry company in the Tercio, or Regiment of Sicily. He'd joined the army in 1567 and served first with the Mediterranean galley fleet, taking part in the great naval battle at Lepanto in 1571. In 1587, he was promoted to captain and ordered to muster a company for the Armada. Matute joined the Santa Maria at Lisbon and eventually perished in Blasket Sound. Next, please. Like many of us here, most of us I'm sure, I feel very close to Captain Francisco de Cuellar, that doughty survivor of the Streeter wrecks. Thanks to Francis Kelly's detailed research, we now know much about his background. As a teenager, he enlisted as a soldier with the Indian Guard, escorting treasure fleets between America and Spain. Next, please. In 1580, he took part in the invasion and capture of Lisbon, and a year later was appointed, quote, captain on sea and land on a fleet campaigning in the South Atlantic. During an encounter with English ships, he was unfairly accused of cowardice, and although subsequently exonerated, his career suffered. By the time of the Armada, he was languishing at Lisbon as a reserve officer, unpaid and seeking an appointment. Eventually, he was given command of a galleon, and there we must leave him to the adventures he so vividly describes in his celebrated letter. Next, please. The overall commander of the Armada's 19,000 soldiers was Campmaster Francisco de Bobadilla. Under him were 7 tercios, or regiments. Each was commanded by a colonel, supported by a sergeant major. The latter was much more than a senior NCO. He was responsible for organizing and practicing the drill movements by which large bodies of troops were assembled, maneuvered, and deployed in response to the rapidly changing situations on a battlefield. Good drill was not a ceremonial nicety, but a vital combat requirement. Next, please. Orders were given by voice, drum, fife, or standard to initiate and control complex and carefully rehearsed military maneuvers. This required mathematical calculations to ensure that the troops retained proper order and spacing during tactical moves which sought to outwit and overwhelm those of the enemy. The standard bearer or ensign of each company was a lieutenant, who was also its second in command. In the chaos of battle, the standard was a rallying point with almost sacred connotations for the troops. It usually incorporated the ragged cross of Burgundy. Next, please. There were 26 companies in an Armada tercio. Each was commanded by a captain whose symbol of office was the jineta, a pole arm decorated with tassels and cased in brass-studded velvet. Part of such a shaft has been recovered from the Trinidad Valancera. Companies averaged just over 100 in strength, ranging between 37 and 175. They were made up, again in average figures, of 53% pikemen, 37% arquebusiers, and 10% musketeers. A sergeant, like his grander counterpart in the senior company, was responsible for drilling and controlling the troops. His mark of rank was a halberd, while the 2 corporals under him, who commanded escuadras, or platoons, were distinguished by their partisans. A drum major regulated the tercio's signaling codes. He was expected to know the meanings of those used by neighboring and friendly units, and, if possible, by those of the enemy too. Next, please. There were no recruiting offices or boot camps in the Spanish army of 1588. How soldiers were drawn to the colours is illustrated by Cuellar's experience in 1581, when he was promoted to captain and ordered by Philip II to raise a company, as documented by Francis Kelly. There were no officers' uniforms as such, but he was provided with funds to buy a linen shirt, doublet, hose, and wide-brimmed feathered hat. You can see it at the back of the hall here, appropriate to his new rank. These items come from La Trinidad Valancera. Thus attired, he went on to purchase a captain's baton, a drum, and a company standard. Next, please. After appointing a sergeant, ensign, drummer, and junior NCOs as the core of his company and equipping them appropriately, Cuellar proceeded to Iquique on the Guadalquivir River, some 50 miles northeast of Seville, whose magistrates had been ordered by the king to underwrite a 21-day recruiting campaign. As recruits signed up, men from 16 to 50 were eligible. They were issued with basic clothing, equipment, and weapons against future stoppage of pay, and Queller and his NCOs began knocking them into shape. By the close of the recruiting period, 44 had signed up and taken the oath. Their baggage was loaded onto mules, again supplied by the long-suffering citizens of Iquique, and Queller marched his still somewhat ramshackle band off to join the fleet at Seville. There they began to integrate with their new comrades, learning weapon skills, drills, and military routines under the shouted orders and occasional rough handling of their superiors. If they survived and didn't run away, they would in due course become trained soldiers. Next, please. A recruit began his service as an unarmoured second-rank pikeman. These were posted at the centre of a formation and only came into action as reserves if the frontline troops were pushed back or when the enemy took flight. They were the easiest to train and cheapest to equip. As they paid off their equipment debts, honed their military skills, and got some active service under their belts, they might ultimately become pikas coslets, front-line troops wearing expensive half armour for protection. 9,000 pikemen of both categories sailed with the Armada. Next, please. These pike staves are from La Trinidad Valenciera. None is complete, but their full length would have been around 18 feet. Costing 12 reales apiece, the equivalent of 3 pairs of shoes, a pike weighed about 12 pounds. It was made of straight-grained Spanish ash, slender towards the point and thickening for rigidity and balance before tapering to a metal ferrule at the butt. Inexpertly handled, it was cumbersome, hard to control, and prone to entanglement with its neighbours, but in drilled unison it could deflect a cavalry charge or block an infantry advance. It was tipped with a small iron point, reinforced by riveted straps extending some way down the shaft on either side. These prevented the end from drooping or breaking off on impact. They might also protect it from sword cuts. All the momentum and inertia of this heavy weapon when thrust forward or receiving an advancing target was concentrated into the tip, generating as much penetrative force as a bullet. The famous push of the pike was no idle phrase. In practice, however, pikes deflected rather than disabled cavalry, for no horse will deliberately impale itself on a hedge of points. But a deflected charge loses force, focus, and impact, so a well-coordinated combination of bullet and pike could break an attack, and once charging cavalry or advancing infantry lose cohesion, they are open to counterattack with close-quarter weapons. Pike drills were based on classical precedents. 16th century pikemen were placed in files behind the firearms men, through whose ranks they could advance to present an overlapping stepped hedge. Full-length pikes were impractical at sea, and during the voyage they were kept in the hold. Next, please. These pikes photographed in situ on La Trinidad Valenciera are still wrapped in bundles. While at sea, short pikes, medias picas, were kept on deck, ready for shipboard combat. Next, please. 7,000 Armada soldiers were arquebusiers. The arquebus was a light, smooth-bore muzzle loader with matchlock ignition. It was 5 feet long and weighed about 10 pounds. Several have been recovered from the Armada wrecks, and this example comes from La Trinidad Valenciera. Its bore was 1/2 inch, and it fired a 3/4-ounce lead ball. Because its recoil was modest, it had a curved butt that tucked into the chest. A brass-tipped ramrod housed in the stock was used to tamp home powder and ball. The charge was ignited by a hinged arm, or serpentine that brought a slow-burning fuse into contact with priming powder in a pan linked to the main charge. Discipline and regular practice were necessary to hone the actions and movements needed to maneuver in formation, reload, and fire in a choreographed sequence. Moreover, the saltpeter impregnated match, which had to be kept alight whenever action was in progress or anticipated, was expensive. Nor could it be used in wet conditions, while at night its glow might give away a soldier's position. These difficulties were less acute when arquebusiers were detached as free-ranging skirmishers, as they often were. Likewise, raw aggression rather than regulated discipline was needed for the short-lived, adrenaline-fueled chaos of a boarding action at sea. After discharging a final shot, the weapon, swung from its barrel end, made an effective club. Next, please. The musket was more cumbersome. 6 feet in length and weighing 18 pounds, it fired a 3/4-inch, 1.5-ounce lead ball. This example comes from La Trinidad Valenciera too. It had the same matchlock firing mechanism as the arquebus. To absorb the heavier recoil, its straight butt nestled into the pad of the shoulder like a modern firearm. Next, please. Each firearm-equipped soldier carried 2 hopper-shaped wooden powder flasks, one for the main charge and a smaller one for priming. Both types have been found on the Trinidad Valenciera. A mechanism on the spout of the larger flask measured the correct amount when inverted, and the charge was tipped into the barrel by pressing a spring-loaded lever. Next, please. A bullet pouch hung on the belt, along with looped coils of match from which lengths could be cut and clamped into the serpentine's jaws. Constant readjustment was necessary as the fuse burnt down, another unhelpful distraction in the heat of battle. There was no absolute standardization in the calibers of arquebuses and muskets, so each soldier carried a bullet mold matched to his weapon. Boat-shaped lead ingots were available for casting fresh shot. Each nominally weighed a quintal, 100 pounds or so, and their shape and weight allowed them to be slung in pairs across a pack animal. Next, please. For personal combat, each soldier, whatever his rank or primary weapon, carried a rapier slung on his left hip and a dagger on his right. Bladed weapons are easier to draw from opposite sides. Footwear was complemented by cloth anklets, while rope-soled alpargatas were often worn on campaign. Leather canteens for water or wine were slung on cords from the shoulder. On the march, these could be held aloft Spanish fashion to catch the stream in the mouth. A bedding roll and canvas knapsack completed an infantryman's kit. Next, please. Within the companies, soldiers were grouped in camaradas, or sections of 6 to 8. As in a family, this is an optimum bonding number, large enough for individuals to integrate as mutually supporting comrades, yet not so numerous as to encourage factions. On campaign, they shared a billet or a tent. Small group psychology has conditioned this size of military sub-formation from the Roman contubernium or tent party to the infantry section of modern armies like these American grunts in Vietnam. Interpersonal relationships and support within such tight-knit comradeships, especially under stress, are the building blocks of an army's cohesion and strength. When the chips are down, you look after your mates, and they look after you. Next, please. On land, arquebuses and musketeers formed up in files 6 or more deep. The front man in each file fired on the word of command, before returning to the rear, while the other men each advanced 1 pace. With each successive move, a soldier performed a specific part of the loading routine, so that when he arrived at the head of his file, he was ready to fire. The full drill probably took about a minute to complete, so a trained 6-deep formation of 9 files, as shown here, could discharge a volley of 9 rounds every 10 seconds or so. Next, please. Spanish soldiers adopted formations on the battlefield that allowed their weapons to be deployed effectively en masse. Pikemen were the inner core of most configurations. They were protected on all sides by arquebusiers and musketeers, and often supported by artillery and cavalry. Each branch had a style of fighting adapted to its weapons, and the troops were rehearsed in drills that allowed commanders to maneuver them without losing discipline and cohesion. This enabled soldiers to move in concert and adapt their formations in ways that kept each man in the right position with his flanks protected and enough space to wield his weapon to best effect. What is today the ceremonial precision of a military parade was a matter of life and death in the 16th century. Classical texts such as the Tactics of Aelian were avidly read by those with military aspirations, and, suitably adapted to modern weaponry, they underpinned tactical thinking. Several drill books were current in Spain at the time of the Armada. Particularly significant is Martin de Aguilar's Milicia, Discurso y Regla Militar, a detail of which is seen here. It contains much information about battle formations, including tables for calculating procedures for maneuvering soldiers in formation. This diagram shows a square of pikemen boxed around by arquebusiers and musketeers, with others protecting the flanks. Beyond the corners of the square are more troops arrayed in projecting rectangles like the bastions of a fortress. Mathematical calculations to ensure the correct spacing appears in the margin. This is just one of many combinations, each describing drills for the configuration and deployment of troops. Next, please. A contemporary picture of a Spanish armada advancing to contact is seen in one of the Escorial's murals. It depicts the amphibious landings on Terceira in 1582 and was painted between 1585 and 1591, so it's absolutely current with the Armada. Its similarity to the D-Day landings of 1944 is striking. The troops have stormed ashore from landing craft and arrayed themselves in battle order before setting off towards their objective. Next, please. We see one of the tercios in detail here. Pikemen form an apparently solid square in the center, though its solidity is deceptive. Space must have been allowed inside for the 9 company standards that emerge from it, together with the command hubs they represent, as well as for the pioneers and baggage train noted in Aguiles's diagram. This discrepancy probably arises because of an abundance of 18-foot pike shafts held vertically within a hollow square would appear from ground level to be a solid mass. The formation is a compact one, suitable for advancing against threats in any direction. The pike square is surrounded on 3 sides by firearms men in files 8 feet deep in the vanguard and rear guard, well placed for loading and the loading and firing drills described earlier. Next, please. The campaign to occupy Kent and seize London called for heavy artillery to breach fortified positions. In February 1588, the Venetian ambassador to Spain reported that the Armada had embarked 12 heavy siege guns and 48 smaller ones, with a double supply of gun carriages and wheels. 3 siege guns were loaded onto La Trinidad Valenciana, and all 3 have now been recovered. Their matching 40-pounder bronze cañones de batir, cast by Remigio de Hulot of Malines in 1556, and bear the full arms of Philip II, quartered by those of his then-wife, Mary Tudor, Queen of England. Next, please. Remarkably, one of the pieces, identifiable by its unique weight of 5,316 Castilian libras, was drawn to scale by a Spanish official in 1586. Exactly 4 centuries before, I did exactly the same without knowing of my predecessor's effort. Happily, the archives confirm the coincidence. You can see there is the weight on my version of the gun, and though you can't see it, it's the detail there, exactly the same figure on Juan de Acuña's 1587 version. So it's gratifying to note that our separate efforts compare so neatly. Artifacts and documents can indeed speak directly to one another. And there I will leave it. Prospects, I should just say, prospects for the next generation of Armada studies in the archives and on the seabed are indeed rosy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin. You can. I'll take those for you. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. So we're up and underway. And just to fill in a couple of extra details for you, if you have people who might be interested but aren't here in watching the lecture series both this morning and again tomorrow, we are live streaming on the Spanish Armada Ireland website. So we're on both Facebook and YouTube. You just need to send people the link, www.SpanishArmadaIreland.com, and the links are there. So you can watch in if you're around Ireland or abroad. So I know we've a few latecomers, and you're all very welcome. It's great to see what amounts to a full house almost at this particular point. A big welcome once again to all of our TIDE and EU Atlantic area colleagues. A special warm welcome to His Excellency de la Riva, Spanish Ambassador to Ireland, who's with us for the events here today as well. So now to our next speaker. And when the wreck of one of the Spanish Armada ships became visible following winter storms at the beginning of 2015, we at Spanish Armada Ireland contacted the underwater archaeology team at the National Monument Service. They came, surveyed the site, and put in place a detailed operation that yielded the safe return to shore of 9 Armada cannon from the wreck of La Juliana and several other priceless artefacts. Leading that operation was our next speaker, who's head of the Underwater Archaeology Unit, and who will now describe that operation and the origins of the cannons themselves. Would you please welcome Finbar Moore?
Great. Oh yeah, thanks. No, great. Thanks very much, Micheál, for the introduction, and thanks to the organisers of the TIDE Conference and Grange Armada Development Association, Spanish Armada Ireland, for the invitation to give this presentation here this morning. I won't go into any great detail on the origins of the Armada. I think they've been well rehearsed over the years, and I'll just try and tell the story of what we did here back in the 1980s. What happened here in the 1980s and what we did a few years ago. But just to, oh yeah, I point to this. Yeah, that's it. But just a brief introduction, just to give us a sense of the context. 16th century Europe, time of conflict and war over land, religion, trade, and empire. The English privateers harrying Spanish ships on their voyages from the Americas, the support for England for the Calvinist cause in the Spanish Netherlands, the general sort of the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, leading to any hopes of an English monarch being, Catholic monarch being put back on the throne of England diminishing, Philip II's determination to reverse that situation and to dethrone Queen Elizabeth and the development of his Spanish Armada with the support of the Pope, and the rest, as they say, is history. But it had significant consequences for Ireland, and I know that Dr. Declan Downey will be talking more about that later. I've heard him speak many times on it, and survivors of the Armada were enlisted in the forces of O'Neill and O'Donnell in the north of Ireland, and trained them in the tactics of modern warfare. The wrecking of the wrecks off the west coast of Ireland created a kind of a fear among the English that Ireland could be used as a backdoor to invasion, and hastened the move of the Tudor conquest and the plantations of Ulster and Munster, and the colonisation, if you like, of Ireland that followed the Battle of Kinsale at the beginning of the 17th century. So it had significant consequences for Ireland. It was after the Geraldine Rebellion that the Munster was being in the process of being colonised, and there was a fear that Ulster would too, and with the Spanish support, that became significant, and a significant factor in our history, and why the events took the shape they did in the subsequent centuries. So 26 ships, 130 ships set out. Just over half arrived home, 26 ships lost around the coast of Ireland, and so far 6 have been identified, and 3 of these are in Strida. And hopefully in years to come, more information will be found on the other ships that we know were lost off the coast of Ireland. The 3 ships at Strida were recorded almost immediately. The Governor Bingham of Connacht had maps prepared, and in 1589 we see 3 ships lying off Strida, similar to what we see in the great model that has been created as part of the TIDE project, and which gives a great sense of how they might have looked shortly after they were stranded at Strida, or beached at Strida. Back to 1985, a group of English divers, and with advice, as already been said, from Colin Martin, identified the location of the 3 wrecks at Strida, and in particular the wreck of La Juliana, the Spanish vessel, the merchant vessel of 1570 date. So the group of English divers, as they titled themselves, the Spanish Armada group, carried out a detailed survey of what they uncovered of the Juliana at the time. You can see the rudder here. Sorry, rudder. Is this a pointer as well? Is it? Yes. Anyway, a large rudder, and a number of guns and anchors and shot as well as that. They carried out surveys, magnetometry survey in particular, and identified 3 concentrations of material, which have been subsequently confirmed to be the locations of the Lavia, Santa Maria de Vizon, and La Juliana, the 3 large merchantmen requisitioned by Spain to serve the Levant squadron under the command of Don Martin de Bertandona, and was wrecked at Strida on the 21st of September 1588, and only possibly 300 survived of over 1,000 crew, and 140 put to death by the sword when they reached shore, and a large number drowned. So, as has been said, and why we're gathered here, is partly to commemorate that event and the tragic loss of life. So the focus at the time, because they had evidence for the Lavia, for the Santa Maria de Vizon, the Lavia with a cannon from the Alberghetti foundry in Venice. The Lavia Venetiana was a ship of a Venetian merchantman. So they had identified that location. They had good evidence for the Juliana, and the other concentration is presumed to be that of the Santa Maria de Vizon. So the Juliana, built in Barcelona in 1570, a merchant ship, originally named the Santa Maria Santiago Santa Clara. We know the ship's owner was Jean Arnaud Paulo of the Maturo, one of the nobles of Maturo near Barcelona, and the Paulo family are still reside in Maturo, and have enormous archive of material in relation to the Armada, and in relation to the Juliana in particular. When built, carried 40 pieces of ordnance, because even though a merchant vessel, there was a concern from Barbary pirates from plying the Mediterranean that they might be attacked at any time. So it was always important to defend yourself, even if you're a merchant vessel. And because she was well armed, although not a frontline warship, she was, though a merchant vessel, she was requisitioned 3 times by Philip of Spain for his Armada in 1588. Service at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, and more about that later. And the Battle of Terceira in the Azores in 1583, when Spain finally took over the last remaining outpost of the Portuguese Empire. And also at the Battle of Lisbon in 1580. So she saw a lot of service before ending up off the coast of Ireland. A merchant carrack, similar to this one here, with the pronounced prow and the high castellated stern and the gun emplacements along on both sides. This is the model for what was the exhibition over here, the reconstructions. 1985, the Armada group identified this rudder, and they recovered 3 guns, 2 Pedreros and a Saker. And there was a demi-cannon under the rudder, which was left intact. And again, more about that later. And so there was a protracted legal case afterwards in the state claiming the right to ownership, or at least to regulate activities on the site. And the judgment was that the material was of such importance that it should be best dealt with under heritage law rather than the salvage law, and that still remains the case. In the meantime, the Grange Armada Development Association was formed and promoted the story of the Armada over a number of years. And in 2014, 2015, severe storms had a lot of material was washing up, and that's where we came into the picture. This large timber that you see here might well be part of that rudder that was identified back in 1985. So we came in 2015, carried out side-scan sonar, and identified a number of anomalies which could be carriage wheel or guns, etc. And subsequent to that, undertook a dive project on the wreck site. The earliest dive we undertook, we identified these 2 cannon, which showed significant evidence for abrasion, and there was a concern that the dynamics of the part of the seabed they were in were having a detrimental effect on this material. It's in a surf zone, and that has its own consequences. And if material is exposed, it'll get eroded. But luckily, as it turned out, a lot of the material had obviously been buried for centuries and was in very good condition. So this is the location on a fine day, and only about 100 odd meters offshore. Ben Bulb in the background, very sort of picturesque and a lovely place to be working. But on other days, it's more like this in the surf zone, and you can be bobbing around and trying to hold your place while you're trying to undertake a bit of survey work in those conditions. And they're possibly not even a patch on the conditions that the Armada faced back in 1588. So as we undertook our work, cannons were revealed. And these 2, one is showing a long Saker with a depiction of St. Matrona, a crest, the year of manufacture, and the weight of the gun, all visible on it. And St. Matrona with a ship and a cross, typical depiction of her. So this effectively meant that we could confirm beyond doubt that we were dealing with the Juliana, given the association with Barcelona. Also on this shorter Saker, a depiction of John the Evangelist, and a similar kind of crest and markings on it. So we knew we were dealing with something extremely significant and incredibly well preserved, and we reported back, and it was approved. We were approved to carry out further work on the site, and carried out detailed recording of disposed wreck and artefacts was undertaken over a number in June and July of 2015. So, and we had a vessel hired which could lift up to 2 ton in weight from Anthony Irwin from Dula Namara from Black Sod, which was invaluable to our efforts. A pulley system was put in place to recover the guns. Our dive supervisor, Rob Morrison, devised a system with a pontoon on the surface and a counterweight to the guns and the pulley system, which meant they could be pulled up like a feather, but then when you got to the surface, they weighed a ton. So that was the tricky bit to get them ashore, or get them on board the vessel. Excuse me. Yeah. So we combined the results of the 1985 survey and the 2015 survey, and you can see here that we have 8 gun carriage wheels, we have 9 cannon. The rudder obviously is gone, but 2 anchors as well as a concentration of stone and iron shot and pottery, etc., across the wreck site. So good evidence for the wreck, and the distribution of the material shows the impact of storm activity over the centuries. In 1570, as I said, when the Juliana was built, it carried 40 pieces of artillery. I won't go into any detail on this. You can just browse through the slide if you like. In 1586, it had 28 guns when it was embargoed in Sicily, and 3 gun carriages reinforced with iron and 6 wheels for the heavy artillery. So, and then in 1588, 2 further guns, cannon de batteur, were loaded onto the Juliana, and to date they haven't been found, but we are hopeful that they're more than likely still there. They'd have been stored in the hull, in the lower part of the hull of the ship, and unlikely to have been salvaged at the time. So, and that's just that's in 1588. Then it had 32 guns on board, according to the muster of Lisbon, and it had of that 12 guns have been found. We have the 2 bronze Moanes, or heavy sakers. We have the 2 bronze sakers as well. We have 2 of the medio sakers, 1 of the bronze falconets, of which there were 4, and the 4 original bronze padreros, 1 possible iron esmeralda, but there were 12 on it, and it's a bit of a mystery why they haven't been identified. Perhaps they were lightweight and easily salvaged at the time. There were 2 demi-cannon, and we have 1, and we still have to find the 2 cannon de batteur. So a lot to be done in that regard. The heavy sakers, 1 depicting San Severo, also associated with Barcelona, martyred in the 4th century under the Diocletian persecutions, and the other which depicting John the Baptist. And you can see the weight mark, just out of interest. The marked weight is slightly lighter than the actual weight, and that maybe Colin might have more information on that, but it could be that the scales were not 100% accurate. Also, there's build-up of material within the chase or the muzzle of the cannon, and the effect of water soaking into them can also add to the weight. So it may be that they're closer in weight, but they're close enough to know that we're dealing with probably the original cannons that were listed in the various musters. And that's a close-up showing San Severo, the Bishop of Barcelona, and the picture of Saint John, John the Baptist. So, and again, the heavy falcons, again, 2 saints associated with Barcelona, Saint Hilaria and Saint Matrona. And again, the weight marks slightly different to the recorded weight, but at the same time, close enough to be, reasonably sure that these are the guns that were described at the time. So, and these guns would have been deployed in various parts of the ship, and more of that maybe anon. But that's just a close-up showing Saint Hilaria with the crucifix, the martyr's crucifix, and Saint Matrona again depicted with a ship and a cross. Medium falcon then, and again with depictions of saints. All these are from the foundry of Dorino II, the Giordi foundry in Genoa. 6 of the guns recovered by us, and 1 from 1985 were all from a foundry in Genoa. So then we have the 4 Padreros on board the ship. 1 with a worn saint on it from the foundry in Genoa, and then we have 1 that was that one depicted a female saint, and then we have two more, and one which may have been recovered from the Battle of Lepanto. So they're the distribution of the 4 Pedreros on the vessel. And that's one of the Pedreros recovered in 1985 from the Genoese, would have been one of the Genoese or Giordi foundry Pedreros. It looks pristine there, but has been conserved and a lacquer applied to it, so it looks like it's new. This is one of the Pedreros here, the middle one up there from, is there a point on that? No, there isn't. From Sicily, Federico Massara, the famous gun maker from Sicily, his distinctive markings, like a slight spur-like marking near at the back of the cannon there, and near the cascabel, and it's typical of his kind of workmanship. Another Pedrero Massara, again with that sort of spur-like decoration at the end of the gun, indicating his style of craftsmanship, or his markings, if you like. There was an Ottoman Pedrero also on it, with an Islamic inscription made by Master Mustafa, Amel al-Mu'alla Mustafa. Mustafa was a gun founder, we know, in Constantinople in the later part of the 16th century. So this may well have been a prize from the Battle of Lepanto. We weren't aware that it was so significant until it was being brought ashore and lifted off our dive vessel onto the pier, and the inscription was visible underneath it. So a very significant find, and showing as well a little link to the tensions and the background to the war that took place between the League of Catholic States and the Ottoman Empire, and culminating the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. So we have falconets as well, and as I said, and this is the falconet that we recovered, depiction of St. John the Evangelist on it, and again from the Giordi foundry in Genoa. And we have a demi-cannon, which was first identified back in 1985 underneath the end of the rudder, but it was not recovered at the time. And when we identified it again in 2015, it was in perfect condition. And again, the work of Federico Mazzara, of the gun founder in Sicily. And you can see the beautiful decoration on it, flame-like designs and spur-like designs around it. And the beautiful lifting dolphins, and a depiction of St. Peter looking heavenward. So we recovered that, and along with the others, it's ongoing conservation. A close-up of the depiction of St. Peter, and it's typical of the period, the depictions of the saints that you see in any church, or in Spain or Italy, or in the Mediterranean at the time. Renaissance-style depictions. And so most of the saints we have on the guns were mostly martyrs. 8 guns had saints on them. So from the top left, we've got St. Matrona, St. John the Evangelist, St. Rocco, St. Hilaria. On the bottom right, St. Sebastian, an unidentified one, St. Peter, and St. John the Baptist. These martyrs, why were they so attached to them? Possibly because they felt they would enhance their protection while they're at sea, and protect them against pirates or against the heathen English at the time when they were heading for battle. But these would have been put on the ship when it was built in 1570 and was a merchant vessel. So it was important to the Matura family in particular that these saints were on the guns that were protecting them. So that's just St. Rocco. St. Rocco, for example, 14th century survivor of the plague, and now very much venerated for that reason as someone who can help people who are victims of plague and suffering. And St. Rocco's dog, which was a reason for his survival, when he hid out in the woods, the dog brought him a loaf of bread every day, and the dog is beautifully depicted on this particular gun. This is the Cathedral of Barcelona, the Cathedral of the Holy Cross in St. Hilaria. There are 140 saints depicted in the cathedral, but all the saints and the guns are represented there. So here you have St. Matrona and St. Hilaria co-patron saints of Barcelona on the guns, and here you have them in the cathedral in Barcelona, almost identically represented. Again, you have in the various tombs and chapels to the saints. Here's St. Matrona, Chapel of St. Sebastian, St. Hilaria, St. Rocco, all very much venerated and still to this day in that part of the world. So what else? We have cannon shot on board. We recorded up to 50 pieces of shot when we were undertaking our work there, with and some pottery, Iberian pottery adhering to it. So that sort of raises questions about how much activity the Juliana was involved in, say, at the Battle of Gravelines or during the campaign off the coast of England or off the coast of France. But not a whole. It may well be that they didn't get a chance to fire off a lot of it. But one of the guns, the Sansevero Saker, had a blowout hole in the side of it, so no doubt they did get involved in some action. That's just highlighting the shot there on board the Juliana. And thanks to local people like Declan Brune and others walking the Strand of Strida, stone shot is picked up every so often, having been washed ashore. And here is the 22nd Duke of Medina Sidonia visiting the National Museum Conservation Laboratory a few years ago and holding one of the stone shot that was adhering to the only carriage wheel that we recovered of the 8 during our project there. So he was very sort of delighted to be able to make that kind of tangible contact with the wreck and the story of his ancestor. Ongoing conservation in the museum and the guns. Hannah Power is the conservator, and of late Helen Butler, new conservator in the National Museum with a particular expertise on conserving material from underwater environments, is also working on the guns and the carriage wheel and the cauldron and various items that were recovered back in 2015. So that's just the ongoing process of desalinization and conservation by the National Museum, and hopefully they'll be fit for display in the not-too-distant future. So what's left at Strida? Well, possibly between the 3 wreck sites, you could have over 60 more guns still sitting there, depending on how many were salvaged at the time of their wrecking. The wreck itself, there are substantial timbers. There are a number of carriage wheels, pottery, and anchors, and various, no doubt, smaller items that are buried in the sands of Strida. So, as no doubt, over the years to come, there'll be more information and more discoveries made, and hopefully that will be the case. So, thanks to various people who supported us in the course of our project there, and particularly from myself, thanks to my colleagues Carl Brady and Connie Kelleher, who were close collaborators with me in every step of the way on this project. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Finbar. I better put on the glasses. Now to one of our visiting colleagues, who for many years has travelled from Spain to be with us for remembering the Armada, which takes place every September in Grange and at Strida. Recently published author, his work on the more than 3,000 Armada survivors taken prisoner after the event will be described here. Please welcome from Murcia, Spain, Pedro Luis Chinchilla. Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I greatly appreciate the invitation made by Spanish Armada Ireland, as well as the sponsor of this international event, to have the opportunity to present the results of our research in a forum of the scientific quality that we have been able to enjoy thus far. Perhaps you should forgive our audacity, because the research we are presenting has been done by an amateur author on the history of the Armada and not by a real academic historian. an amateur who has been disseminating the story of the Armada for 7 years now, and has found a historiographical vacuum that he decided to fill in with his study Spanish Armada Prisoners, published in Spanish by Penguin Random House in February of this year. It has made a great media and academic impact in Spain. To date, the studies of Spanish Armada of 1588 has been discussed in technical, political, strategical, or archaeological treatises, overlooking the ultimate fate of almost 3,000 who remain unaccounted for to date. Now, for the first time, our study not only rescues them from oblivion, but it also matches names and surnames to early 800 of them, the circumstances of their captures, the places they were held, and their ultimate fate in a story that highlights the human aspect and the saga created by these men at the service of the Spanish crown. Who they were, where they came from, their trades and occupations, their ages, what they looked like, relationships with family and friends, and even what they wore. With just one paper published on the prisoners from the Armada, published in 1988 by Dr. Paula Martin, and which referred to the prisoners captured from the Nuestra Señora del Rosario and San Pedro el Mayor, the rest of the literature, Spanish, Irish, and English, has not addressed this issue with the thoroughness necessary to shed light on it. So let's go know more about them. Freed, on the run, or slain in cold blood, relic documents will allow us to put names to many of these people and discover the calvary they were subject to, thus keeping alive their memories and legacies, slumbering on beaches or in houses, barns, castles, local legends, and, unfortunately, also in mass graves. The first mass arrest of sailors and sailors happened during the squadron's skirmishes which took place in the English Channel from 31st of July to the 8th of August 1588, when the Battle of Gravelinas was fought, and when Don Pedro de Valdez surrendered his galleon Nuestra Señora del Rosario to Francis Drake and the abandon of the San Salvador. Some days later, this list grew after the 5 ships' attacks against the Armada anchored in Calais from the 7th to the 8th August. The San Lorenzo, the San Mateo, the San Antonio de Padua, and the San Felipe sailing ships were seized by the Anglo-Dutch enemy forces. Later, as the Armada rounded the British islands on its returns to Spain, due to shipwrecks and unforeseen circumstances, at least 20 ships will increase the list of prisoners from the Armada. Now are 3,000. From the very beginning, the concern of Philip II and Duke of Parma regarding the rescue of castaways and prisoners was manifest. The number of notable surnames among them, in addition to the strictly humanitarian character of the king, great faith, immediately set into motion a large operation to search for English prisoners in Spanish jails that might be exchanged. Along with the discreet work of the espionage service, diplomatic channels were used to achieve the liberation of as many prisoners as possible. Meanwhile, unlike the events in Ireland with her subordinates, Fitzwilliam and Bingham, Elizabeth I did not show any special animosity toward Spanish prisoners in England. Although the majority did suffer a very harsh captivity in which they received just enough food to stay alive, the truth is that very few died during their confinement in England. The rescues paid for them were fair, so to speak, and the monarch even ended up showing some noble gesture towards them. For example, she allowed ships carrying Spanish soldiers and sailors to drop anchor in England upon their return to Spain after being shipwrecked and managing to reach Scotland. Moreover, when she learned of the tremendous repression to which her subordinates in Ireland were subjecting the prisoners from the Armada, she enacted a pardon for all the castaways who turned themselves into the authorities. 70 to 80 Spanish sailors and sailors accepted the offer. The nationality of the prisoners was decided: Genoese, Venetians, Rausians, Germans, French, Flemish, or Portuguese were often released immediately, either unconditionally or with the promise to enlist the English Navy, or even, in the case of Portuguese, to help in the future attempt to crown in 1599 the pretender and refugee in London, Antonio de Portugal, Prior de Crato. As we know, this ended with the English counter-Armada disaster of 1589, possibly Spain's largest victory over England. The treatment received often depended on the family, surname, rank, or social status. Although not widespread, prisoners considered leading men were able to bear their captivity far better than the poor sailors and sailors. The advantageous conditions of their surrenders, Pedro de Valdés is a case in this point, allowed at least 3,000 nobles and captains to spend their captivity in the homes of English gentlemen of the same social status. Consequently, in many cases, this created a personal attachment or at least mutual respect based on treating in each other as equals. Every man has his price. What we need is to know what it is. This famous phrase, attributed to the 18th century French politician Joseph Fouché, could be perfectly applied to the ransoms offered or paid for each of the prisoners of the Armada. The price of freedom was varied as £10 for a soldier, or the 1,650 paid by Alonso de Luzon, the field master commanding the Tercio Militari until from Naples. As early the 2nd of October of 1588, Elizabeth I agreed to accept a ransom for ordinary prisoners of war. The payments was ordered to be made on the 2nd and 17th March 1589. May of that year, the English government has already accepted the amount required to release 500 men from Duke of Parma. It was set the equivalence of the 1590 pound on the current pound at about 270 euros. The ransoms of the vast majority of sailors and sailors cost Philip II coffers some 8,700 euros per man. This sum included the price of his freedom plus that of his care while imprisoned. This latter amount made up the bulk of the total payment, as the care was set at 5 placas, about 2.75 euros for ordinary prisoners. With this same equivalence among pounds, the ransom of a leading man reached the current amount of up to 500,000 euros, and along with the chain of some other prisoners. A case in point is Odette de Lannoy, a French soldier, diplomat, and notable poet, exchanged for Diego de Pimentel and other important members of the Spanish nobility. At times, the usury of some English nobles, as in the case of William Corney, led them to ask for up to 5 times the estimated value for each of their prisoners. This did nothing but desperately prolong the negotiations and therefore their captivity. In any event, and with the dramatic savagery of what had happened in Ireland and some occasional cases, the release of many soldiers and sailors occurred relatively quickly and without excessive difficulties. Today, standing before this forum in Ireland, I will focus on what happened in this territory when up to 1,650 crewmen were taken prisoners for 20 documented vessels. One of them was a ship that historian has given up, lost in some undetermined place, probably the Hebrides, the hulk Santa Barbara. Nevertheless, we have been able to locate its wreck in Ireland thanks to the documents found about its captain, Bartolomé Bravo, who was murdered in Galway prison, and also thanks to the trace left by other prisoners. In fact, we know today the date it was shipwrecked, 20 September 1588. Although 75% of the Armada capacity managed to return to Spain, the specific circumstances of some ships, especially the lack of drinking water and food, caused part of the Armada to head to the Irish coast. However, most of the Armada, whose return, thanks to the sensible decision taken by Medina Sidonia, took place far away. Immersed in a process of colonization, the island could not yet be considered English territory, no matter how often Henry VIII has proclaimed himself King of Ireland since 1530. In fact, the colonization process is still unfinished in 1588, in which the new Protestant religion clashed with the Catholicism of the secular Irish nobility and even with the early English colony. That made Ireland a hostile and chaotic territory that England was struggling mightily to subject. As nowhere else, the situation of the English forces in Ireland determined the tragic ends of these prisoners from the Armada. With fewer than 1,000 English troops in the island, who were poorly fed and even more poorly armed, the English were unable to handle the arrival on the coast of hundreds of survivors of the Armada shipwrecks. Fearful of possible alliances between Spanish troops and local clans against the few English forces in Ireland, led Lord Deputy William Fitzwilliam and Lord President of Connaught, Richard Bingham, to order the systematic execution of practically all the prisoners. The massacres in Galway prison and Aliach Castle, with more than 300 prisoners killed at each side, gives us an idea of the magnitude of the Irish tragedy. Thus, we know that of the 1,650 prisoners captured in Ireland, at least 1,100 were killed in compliance with the directives of Fitzwilliam and Bingham. Although Galway prison and Drogheda prison were two of the main detention centers, some prisoners were murdered without prior long-term imprisonment. This is what happened with approximately 70 men from the San Esteban and San Marcos who were murdered not in Knocknacroy at the Spanish Point, but almost certainly in Donegal, some 20 kilometers north, or the 90 men from the San Nicolas Brodanelli. This also was the case with the 80 men from the Ciervo Volante murdered by a Scottish mercenary at the order of William Burke. The 100 members of the Grand Green killed by Iogan, Duachedara O'Mail, and most importantly, the dramatic case of the 300 men from La Trinidad Valencera, murdered by a battalion of Englishmen and Irish mercenaries led by Richard and Henry Hovenden after having surrendered when caught on their way to Aliach Castle. This castle was home to Concuba or Daimnich, a Catholic bishop who rendered aid to the 150 survivors of the massacre. Martyred for his faith in 1611, he was beatified in 1992. Let us stop with the events in Stradach. Although most historians believe that the date of the shipwrecks to be 25th of September or 21. The written testimony of a survivor, the soldier Diego Lopez, places it on 20th on the same month. Suddenly, a great storm appeared and swept through the three ships, which seemed to him to have more than 1,300 men, on which only 300 would be saved, and thus did happen it the eve of St. Matthew, 20th September. 1,000 men captured were hung either in the abandoned monastery Stadt Abbey or in the church in Hahamlisch. Another 100 were killed in the immediate vicinity. Of another group of 11 men, 8 were eliminated and 3 managed to escape. George Bingham, Richard Bingham brother, worked meticulously and with great ruthlessness. Special mention should be made to the men who, having been captured by the English, were able to return to Spain. If all the existing literature to date has accepted that practically the 100 to 300 survivors of these 3 shipwrecks were murdered, except for the few who managed to escape via Scotland or the men who preferred to remain on the island protected by an Irish clan, such as Pedro Blanco from the Juliana, Bartolomé Rodríguez, Juan de la Cruz, Juan Pérez Cebada, and Anton Montesinos from the Labia, one thing is certain. We have new information that has allowed us to shed light on this aspect. The only 3 prisoners captured and returning to Spain, of whom we know so far, were the Venice-born Manuel Orlando, captain of the Labia, and his scribe, whose name we don't know, along with the Ragusian Vicenzo de Juan Bartoli, the captain of the Santa Maria Division. These 3 prisoners had been transferred from Ireland to England to Bridewell Prison in London, where they were released by ransoms on credit, that is, not paid in cash before the release. Our research has allowed us to expand this very small number of 3 prisoners from the Labia, the Santa Maria Division, and the Juliana. So now we know 15 captives who were, until now, totally unknown to us. With this information, it can be said that, although few in number, the English did indeed take prisoners of war when these 3 vessels shipwrecked. The prisoners were transferred to the Irish prison in Drogheda, and from there to the prison in Bridewell, where they were released via the Netherlands in October 1589. The usual ransom was paid for all, except for the soldier from Tarragona, Felipe Valdeira, who paid a higher amount, which we don't know, for his freedom. In short, following the disaster of the beach of Stridag, at least 120 men were captured and killed in its vicinity. Only a few, whom we have 18 recorded, managed to survive their captivity and return to Spain. So today, let's pay tribute to these men, and let's say their names aloud for the first time in 435 years. Sorry. From the Santa Maria Division, Pedro Ramirez, son of Juan, native of Valladolid, missing left eye, soldier, 26 years old. Alonso Martín, son of Pedro, native of Illescas, soldier, 25 years old. Miguel Sánchez, father of the same name, native of Caso del Río, Córdoba, with a big... Miguel Sánchez, father of the same name, native of Caso del Río, Córdoba, with a big mark from a wound of his nose, soldier, 22 years old. From the Labia, Gonzalo Martín, son of Jerónimo García, native of Rota, Cádiz, well-built, dark-skinned, no apparent marks, soldier, 25 years old. Juan Sánchez, son of Diego, native of Talavera de la Reina, Toledo, small of body, little facial hair, and with a wound on his temple, soldier 20 years old. Diego Adrián, son of Miguel, native of Tudela, Navarra, dark-skinned, well-built, with a wound on his forehead next to his hair, soldier 30 years old. Juan de Ayla, father of the same name, native of Burgos, has a wound on his upper left eyelid, soldier 20 years old. Alonso de Zaya, son of Juan Castillo, native of Buenache de Alarcón, Cuenca, almost no facial hair and no marks on his face, soldier 20 years old. Hermé, native of the Netherlands, son of Hans, little facial hair and good-looking, 22 years old. Felipe Valdiera, father of the same name, native of Tarragona, Blackbird, soldier, 33 years old. From the Juliana, Pedro Rivadeneira, son of Francisco, native of Lugo, small and little facial hair, soldier, 20 years old. Gregorio Fernandez, son of Marcos, native of Santa Maria de Arcos, Orense, has a wound on his middle of his forehead, soldier, 22 years old. Pedro Montalto, son of Rafael, native of Barcelona, with a wound on the middle of his forehead, sailor, 18 years old. Domingo González, native of Bercha de Castañal, tall, black beard and big mustache, soldier, 36 years old. Alejandro Armero, son of Juan, native of Nice, France, with well-built and little facial hair, sailor, 20 years old. Okay, thank you so much. Leaving Ireland behind now, to conclude, we will refer to the whole of the prisoners captured in Netherlands, England, Ireland, Scotland, and France. Today we know that from at least 31 vessels of the 1588 Armada, almost 3,000 men were captured in these countries by England during that date in 1588. This amount is somewhat greater than the 10% of the approximately 28,600 crew members in this armada. Most of the survivors, mainly soldiers and sailors, were released from November 1589 to January 1590. Those being held that we considered of higher quality, the fewest in number, were released as negotiation advanced for the ransoms between April 1591, December of 1592, and February 1593. One exceptional case in that of the apothecary Lope Ruiz de la Peña, who did not obtain his freedom until March 1597. Very few chose to stay in Ireland or Scotland after the conflict was over. Some decided to re-enlist in the Crown's forces in Flanders. Actually, virtually everyone freed wanted to go home after such a devastatingly traumatic experience, and that is what they did. Some of them, the eldest of all, the Valencia-born Anton López, 60 years old and freed in 1590. The poor Polish child, Gregorio Langes, captured at the age of 12. After he was released in 1590, he returned home alone from the Netherlands. The great humanist and Dr. González de Cunedo, a close friend of one of the great men of the Renaissance, Justo Lipsio, and who lost his entire work when he was captured on the San Mateo and tried to rewrite it all from memory. And yes, some Irish as well, such as the servant of Gerald Fitzgerald, the soldier Matthew Leonard, and Peter Purcell, also a servant. Actually, there was not a single Francisco de Cuellar in the Armada. Today we know hundreds of them. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Pedro, for your presentation. And it's, I suppose it just goes to show just what an emotional issue this is, not only for Spanish people, for Irish people as well. It's a complex history, as we all know, and it's wonderful to hear the names of those soldiers and sailors being mentioned for the first time here this morning. Thank you, Pedro. So we're going to take a coffee break now. Afterwards, we have 3 more presentations. We're going to hear from Pranny Rattigan, who's going to describe the food, or the absence of food, possibly, that led to a lot of the challenges and the health issues that the returning Spanish sailors had on board the Armada ships. We're also going to hear from Dr. Declan Downey, who's going to put a sort of a modern who's going to frame the Armada in a more modern context in light of current conflicts around the world. And we're also going to hear from 2 members of the Spanish Ministry of Culture, Carmen Cabrera and Paloma Sanchez, who are going to describe Spanish underwater cultural heritage and plans for the future. It was mentioned by all 3 speakers this morning, you know, Striga has been central to all of the discussions so far. The delegates, just to fill you in on a little bit of what's going to happen later on. So after lunch, we're all going to, the delegates are going to get on the bus and we're going to go to Striga and we're going to visit the sites and we're going to look at the locations on a much more benign day than what happened in September 1588. But that'll give us a real sort of context and touch and feel for how the Armada story has unfolded and continues to unfold. So a coffee break. During the coffee break, we'll give you a couple of minutes just to get yourself settled in. It's all self-service, unfortunately, up there at the top table. So the people on that side got the right seats. So coffee, tea and biscuits. We're going to give you a couple of minutes to settle in. And then, as was mentioned by Finbar, we have a wonderful diorama which was built specifically for the conference here, which you're welcome to go up and have a little look at as well, which is an artistic impression of the wreck site at Striga. It was built by Nathan Wheeler and Dave Flynn, 2 artists from Dublin who I'm delighted to say are here today. And they're going to, if people are interested and they want to find out a little bit more about how this whole process took place and how they managed to create such a wonderful installation, they'll be chatting to people there in a few minutes. So we'll take maybe 20 minutes for coffee and we'll be back with the next presentations then. Thank you.
Over many years, the members of GADA and Spanish Armada Ireland have been involved in the protection and promotion of the wreck site at Stregia and in continuing Armada legacy. No more than our next speaker, who literally lives a stone's throw from Stregia Beach. Please welcome Dr. Pranny Radhakan.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, ambassador, distinguished guests. A lovely occasion that to be invited to speak about this particular subject. Do we have the slide, the first one? Oh, it got, yeah, okay, there we are. And it was something, of course, that's been near and dear to my heart for many years since being a child. And growing up down the road in Cliffany, and then moving all the way to Stregia. So it's just been one of those names that has always been mentioned and talked about. My father was hugely into the Spanish Armada and where the ships could be, and every visitor and every relation and every tourist who came by was regaled to the stories of what de Queller, as we called him back then, de Cuellar, when we all got connections with Spain and knew how to pronounce de Cuellar and paella. Have I done that correctly? I've been correcting that for years. So, of course, once these connections, looking back on it now, it's like an amazing trajectory, just thinking about how things were back then. When nobody really went to Spain, and of course these wonderful, wonderful, heartwarming connections, and that historic moment this morning, Pedro, when you read that very moving list of what happened just right there on Stregia Beach. So very special. Let me see if this works. So just setting the scene there for Sligo, and I suppose when I was tasked with this particular talk, I had to look for my sources. So, of course, I contacted Eddie, quick text, and he allowed me to raid his library. And then I raided my sister's library. That's Catherine. You'll be meeting her tonight. She scripted the Canon in C and wrote some music for it. So that performance awaits you. And then, of course, if I had been anywhere near Cork, I would have raided Connie Kelleher's amazing library that I know of. And, of course, the local library were fantastic too. So I had some heaps of books all around my bedroom, my office, everywhere. And I suppose it's one of those times that I really wished that I had been, that I was unemployed, unemployable, unattached, and unattachable, and didn't have any commitments at all, and was a social recluse, because going into those books, that's only a small fraction of them there, was just an amazing luxury. Having worked through infectious diseases right through COVID, and working full-time and just being so involved in medicine, I haven't had that luxury of actually reading the story of the Armada. I suppose we've been so insular just looking at this side of it, where de Cuellar did in his trail, but to actually broaden out and to look at what was happening in Spain, what's happening food-wise, what was happening in England. Really quite the story and quite the luxury. And I think going down that, that labyrinth and that burrow of being able to read undisturbed is really quite magical. I'll have to book a week off and just we won't be getting those books back in a hurry, Eddie, I think. Just so amazing. So let's start with Ireland then. Setting the food scene that de Cuellar would have arrived into. And of course we know the story about the people who gave him the oat cakes and the barley bread. And one thing I didn't know, that the Irish, according to Regina, who I would have her books and I never spotted this before, Regina Sexton, a Cork woman, the Irish invented muesli. And she writes about this and how the monks would have, and the poor people, of course, would have eaten their oats very plain, very bland, and on a Sunday, the monks had the special treat where they would have warm, creamy milk and honey, and then they would go out and get the local fruits, where they fronds or wild blueberries or chopped up some apples, and they added that to their oats, and that was their muesli. So I think we got there first before the Swiss, definitely. And of course the dairy, the buttermilk, and sour milk as he calls it, which is of course the buttermilk. So looking at another book, another friend of mine, JP, who's a restaurateur in Galway, it was written at Tome, and he describes how in Ireland, by the time that the English had established control of Ireland, that really the cultures had fused together. So I suppose really it was the something again I wouldn't have thought about, that we grew lentils here back then. All the pulses, the peas, the beans, obviously milk and cheese production were central, and the rabbits, all of the wild food, and there was this wealth divide, where the people in Dublin, they would have had all of the lavish feasts and they hunted and so on, whereas the poor people, as de Clare describes, they were really poor. They were on quite a paltry diet. But of course, they did have seaweeds, which I'll tell you a little bit more about. We have 4 seaweeds up here. I think, Brendan, this works on a little, yeah, there we go. This one is up to 40% protein. It's our porphyra, or our schlauk or schlaukan. This one is one of the kelps, a sugar kelp, Saccharina latissima. Then we have the one that St. Kevin would have written about, the Ilaria or the wakame, again an amazing multi-mineral, multivitamin seaweed. And this one, of course, is the dillisk, or the dulse, the Palmaria palmata, that the monks would have written about, and they would have eaten. This one here, an absolutely beautiful seaweed that, again, just full of minerals and vitamins. So but maybe perhaps I should recommend a nice book. This is the foreword from my book, which was written by Professor Gyrey from Galway, where he talks about the monks having a typical day. So they'd spend a little bit of time gathering their dillisk from the rock, a little while fishing, a little while giving food to the poor, and a little while in the cell. So that was their own cell. They weren't in prison or anything. They were just obviously in their cells. So dating back to the 12th century. So just a summary there, and again, really emphasizing that divide, and I suppose the elaborate feasts that were in some parts of the country, and then that severe poverty in other parts. And again, just looking at that, they were worried about the decline in traditional foods and in traditional ways of preparing due to the influences of the English. Let's have a quick look at Spain then. What was happening there? Well, this tome by Claudia Rodin, The Food of Spain, really so interesting. I mean, again, opened my eyes and really worth a look. Again, that debate between Turkish, Roman, Arabic influences, regional differences. And I suppose even just to pick one little thing out of that, the almond bread, going back to the oats and the barley in Ireland, whereas the almonds were the food for the pilgrims, and still going on to this day and dating back decades and hundreds of years, where this cake and this bread was the food of the pilgrim walk. And then, of course, salting, drying, and alcohol, which was came from Arabic side. Looking at England, I found some very interesting books. This was one, Cuisine and Culture. And I suppose really when we think of Elizabeth, she really changed things. She had fluent Italian. She was very influenced by what was happening in Italy. And when we look at what they ate swan. They, of course, had the birds. And that nursery rhyme that we all know about, again, it was so interesting to read about that, because the one that we know, 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie. When the pie was opened, the birds began to sing. Wasn't that a tasty dish to serve before the king? And sure enough, they baked a kind of a pastry that was called a coffin. And it was a very stiff pastry, quite high at the sides. And then, so they would bake it blind, so it was like a box, and then they put a hole in it and put the actual food that they were going to eat, the pie, into it. And then in the top part, they would trap the larks and the sparrows in on top of the food. You know, where was sanitation in those days? So, of course, it was then presented at the table, and when it was cut open, the birds all went out. They didn't bake it. They allowed the birds, but the birds were trapped in there for a period of time in this coffin. It was so interesting. And then, of course, they flew around when they got out. And then the people ate the pie that the birds had been on. So interesting. She also had the separate dining area for food. So there was a room in the house that had a table, and that's where the leaves came from. So you would expand your table by putting in more leaves. So most interesting. And of course, in those days, sugar was coming in, and the doctors at that time, they actually recommended sugar as a nutritional substance. So interesting. And of course, game and so on, and the puddings. And they also had fish. And of course, fish in the fishing fleet were so important because it was even a common fishing catch that brought Drake the word at the time. So again, very interesting book. Oops, where are we? Looking at the English food that was liquid, because the English loved their ale. They used ale for everything. They used it as a remedy, and then they blamed ale on things. When things went wrong, even if it was an illness, they actually blamed the ale. I suppose we all do that at times, don't we? The ale, and the difference between ale and beer, I never really thought about it. The ale is sweet and heavy, and all the housewives could actually make their own ale. Well, then beer came along with the hops and the spices, and that was completely different. And Elizabeth herself used to drink beer in the morning. And there's documentation of the handmaids in the court. They would drink 8 pints of beer every day. And it wasn't wastage. You know, it wasn't a slop bucket where the waste was going in. They did drink it. Quite amazing. Very interesting. And then, of course, milk. Again, Elizabeth would have envied the milkmaids because their skin was beautiful, and they used to stir the milk with their arms, and they were projected and portrayed as being very beautiful and very healthy, and people drank the milk. And of course, they were protected from smallpox because of the cowpox, and that's where Jenner, the whole idea of the vaccine for the smallpox, came from the milkmaids and the cowpox. So Elizabeth used to really envy them because she had smallpox. So of course, tea and coffee, they really could only read about that because it hadn't arrived in England at that stage. So getting to the Spanish fleet, this was their list of their provisions, and it was bright and cheery, and they really put a lot of work into it because provisions were very important for a long journey. So we can read the list there ourselves. They had everything that we know that came on the Armada boats. But what happened? What went so wrong? It was the delays, really, in that long winter and that long spring, when they waited for the fleet for everything to come right so they could take off. They were warned, or they were asked not to eat the provisions that were put on board most recently. They were asked to use the provisions that were on longer and that were particularly close to the water. But human nature being human nature, they just tucked into whatever the nearest bags were. So the food that was there when they did set off then was starting to spoil. And when we see the dispatches that came from Medina Sidonia, when he was saying that really the food was spoiled and the weather was hot. But I suppose initially he was saying all was well because they had no idea just how many of those casks and barrels were actually spoiled. So we can read it there that even as they went up that first part from Lisbon up to Coruña, they were throwing over barrels of rotten meat into the sea. And of course, at that point, he knew that he had to ask for more provisions to be supplied when they came to Coruña, into Galicia. So we see that the journey was more like December than June as well. The weather was terrible, so these waves were sloshing over the boats and really also making the provisions wet and causing further decay. So this is the short journey that they made here from Lisbon up to Coruña. And I'm bad with numbers, so I did write it down. It was 13 days to go 160 sea miles and 20 days from Lisbon to Coruña. And I was saying this to my husband when I was getting this ready, and he's brought many's a boat from many's a place. And he said, my goodness, what was happening? I mean, that's such a short journey, really. You'd make that journey in no time. But as it's quoted from one of the people who, I forget who actually said it. He said, we were as slow as the most miserable tub among us. So they just had to go in that crescent formation and just keep plugging along. And it was just literally pounding into those waves and moving along as slowly as the smallest ship that was there. Interesting. So, one bit is gone, not to worry. So here we are with our sea captain. So he had actually no experience of either the sea or war, and he was very prone to seasickness, and he was also very prone to having colds. So he wasn't really up for this at all. In fact, he did write to King Philip and say he really didn't want to do it, and he persuaded. But then, of course, when the other admiral died, that was it. He was just on, and when they set off, and when he knew that that everything was just rotting and the provisions were so bad, they decided that they would stay. And King Philip said, take the men off and feed them well for this period of time. Give them fresh bread, fresh vegetables, fish, meat. Don't use the provisions. Get them healthy, because they really were in very bad shape. In fact, they lost 3,000 men from disease and from disease on that way up from Lisbon to Coruña. It's a huge number of men to actually in that short journey. So they did improve. And I suppose before I tell you about that, I have to look back and see this. Well, why did the food spoil? So we know that Drake had made a raid on Cadiz in the harbour in the spring of 1587. And he had burned the ships. And in fact, the seasoned casks that were being stored and gotten ready, they actually were all burnt. They were all in ashes, as they describe in the story of it. So casks then had to be remade for the journey. And they were made from green wood, which of course cracked. And then the water that was in it turned to just a green slime after a short distance, as did the food, because they just weren't seasoned and they just weren't able to hold the food. I found that most interesting. So, and also when they were actually coming up, the water that was breaking up, particularly when they got into the Atlantic, the long waves of the Atlantic were really not doing any favours to boats that were more built for the Mediterranean. So in Coruña, the sick men were taken off and they were brought to the hospitals. The Archbishop organised that. And the guards were put in place because desertion was threatened. And good provisions arrived. And they were getting ready to go again. And as I said earlier, in those first 3 weeks, they lost 3,000 men. Meanwhile, back in England, what was happening? Well, the fledgling Royal Navy was starting, and as was mentioned earlier by Finbar, they were sort of pirates in 1 week, and then there were the Navy the next week, and of course Elizabeth was turning a blind eye to all this piracy. And so there was huge sickness among the English as well. There were rumours of a plague. But again, as I quoted as there from Howard, that neither sickness nor death shall make us yield until this service be ended. And again, they weren't treated very well. And I've written there that there were 6 men were given 4 months' rations. So they weren't really, they were going a bit hungry as well. And they were on the port. They weren't going anywhere too far away. So then just some images of the fleet as they come forward. And I suppose this really took my attention. And I thought, gosh, psychologically and spiritually, they really tried to do their best, because on a Sunday in August, as they approached the very last battle, they gathered for Mass, all the boats, and I can just see that image of them all gathered on the Sunday with, I think they had about 104 priests, the many Dominicans and Franciscans. And the bells were heard ringing out from the different boats as they all rested, and the sails were furled, and they were just praying, and they were having their service. And then, because they were close to Calais, the French gave fresh water supplies, and they also sent on other refreshments. I don't know what those refreshments are, but they sent on refreshments as well, and it seemed all very quiet. Now, it does. There is an account of a cannon shot that went through a sail, just the English letting them know that they were having sort of a little day of rest, and that was soon to change very, very quickly. And I suppose when they say that really the ships were full of disabled and sick men too at this stage, as they were getting ready to go into the North Sea. So as they did go for the North Sea, I suppose really they had been out on the ocean a while now at this stage, because when we think of scurvy, which is a lack of vitamin C, you need to be not taking any fresh vegetables at all for about 3 months before you'll get scurvy. So it surprises me that when they were in Coruña, they were fed well, but perhaps prior to that, even when they were in Spanish port, that they must have had some deficiencies there, that they got scurvy so quickly. And we know scurvy affects the gums, the inflammation, and teeth fall out, and it's just one of those very horrible diseases. Prevented, very easily prevented. I mean, it's, in a week after getting vitamin C, it's practically cured. It's just one of those things we just don't see now in medicine, really, at all. And looking at their little rations then that they got as they were going around to the North Sea, 8 ounces of biscuit, some water, some wine, some interesting things written about the wine that they had kind of saved, some different good wines. But of course they were beginning to die of thirst and disease and semi-starvation, and the chaplains were very busy every day. They were putting the bodies into the deep, really saying prayers and putting the bodies to the deep. So such a situation, I just can't really visualize it when we're in the comfort of our own homes. I had to put a word in on this book because it's an absolute tome. And it talks about potatoes. And I always thought this was a rumour, but there it is in black and white. And I'd love to chat that with our Armada experts. Really, did the potatoes come in or did they not? But again, when I found it, I thought I'd pop it in there because, of course, the Irish are so associated with potatoes now. So the journey home to Spain then, how were rations, how were the men? They were up at quite north, 62 latitude, very cold, up near the Faroe Islands, bitterly cold, and they were huddled down below, really just going out to trim sails. And then I read about some of the folklore, some of the ships with gold goblets and gold plates and so on being lost around Scotland. And again, by the time they reached Ireland, really they were very sick, they were very depleted, they were dying, the provisions were rotten, and nearly empty water casks, those that weren't actually already rotten and had green slime in them. I thought this was so interesting, and I thought I would present it to you as 2 stories of horses. So on the flagship boat, the San Martin, they had 40 of the finest Spanish pedigree horses, and they had 48 mules. And because the water was so scarce, they thought that the easiest thing to do, I suppose, was to let them go, to just put them into the sea. And there are accounts of a fisherman called Mackenzie in Scotland, thinking that he just lost his mind. He was out there and he suddenly sees these beautiful Spanish horses swimming together, trying to find land. And I suppose I found that so interesting because I wondered why they didn't actually kill them and have them as food when everybody was starving on the boat. But maybe they were so ill and so unwell at that stage and had no energy to do anything. Or maybe they just couldn't bear to kill a prized, beautiful Spanish horse. But by contrast, when there's a story of the O'Dohertys, the clan in up north, and they actually helped rescue a shipwrecked boat, and they sold them these garrons, and then the Spanish people, they killed these little horses and found some driftwood and made themselves dinner with butter that came from local people as well. I just thought that was quite interesting. And then, of course, Bingham heard news of it, so everybody was just, oh, thank you, Dec. Everybody was taken to slaughter. Of course, the hospital ships is another story. So death and disease. So I suppose really just to say what happened when they came back again, they were full of disease. The hospitals were full in the northern cities when they landed in. And in the letter from the king, I found, again, this is one of the enigmas, that he didn't blame him. He just said he was so sorry to hear that his health was so bad and go back to his, he didn't say go back to his olive trees, that was from somebody else, but go back and rest and get better and be ready for another battle some other time. And we see there, of course, the loss of life. The hospital ships, I'm just fascinated by the hospital ships, and I'm sure there are experts here who are going to be able to put me clear. I have so many unanswered questions myself from doing this piece of work. I suppose really I have to tell you one small story though about the food on the Armada. In 2015, when the Underwater Archaeology Unit were here, I was in Cadiz doing a presentation and a workshop on marine algae in the University of Cadiz, and people were keeping me posted on the photographs from the cannon being raised. And so anyway, I got a flight and I came back, and we were out in one of the ribs. Actually, Declan Brune, who's down there ringing that bell, he'll have a boat hook out next to get me off. He and I were sitting in the rib waiting to kind of just to share the excitement. We all got a go kind of to go out and be close to where the action was, the mothership, when the cannon were being raised. And Dec, I don't suffer from seasickness, but Dec now was a bit green, and he was saying to me, as we were bobbing around, well, how did you get on in Spain? How was Cadiz? And I thought it was great. I said everything went really well. They gave me a wonderful present. It was this flor de garum, and it's made from fish guts and fish heads, and it's all and fish blood, and it's all fermented down, and it's made into a sauce. And they used to use it on the Armada. Again, they had it kind of fitting into the cubby holes of the Armada. They'd use it like soy sauce, and Dec was just getting greener and greener, and he was saying, "Wait now, let me get this right. So they really liked your talk, and they gave you that. What would they have given you if they hadn't liked it?" So, yeah, always the quick wit, Dec. But that flor de garum is quite amazing. It was their soy sauce. I looked around for it this morning to bring it in. I'll have to show it to you tomorrow if anybody's interested. But I suppose after doing this short research, I just find the whole thing so fascinating. I feel like I'm in that, I want to quote that title of that movie, Everything Everywhere All at Once. I want to know so much more. It is just so exciting. So I think at this point, I'll just wish you a very great conference and a wonderful evening, and we'll see you later on tonight and tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pranny. I hope I'm sure you all enjoyed Pranny's insights and her investigation of questioning that we're going to spend the rest of the day, hopefully exploring a little bit further. So, Pranny, thank you very much for that. Moving on quickly, our next speaker will bring matters right up to the present day, identifying possible links between the geopolitical landscape of the 16th century and present-day conflicts. He was the first citizen to be elected to membership of the Royal Academy of History and has done his PhD in legal and diplomatic history. Welcome, Dr. Declan Downey.
Turning the tide, revealing the past through new eyes. This is the theme of this conference, ladies and gentlemen, and so my presentation departs from my usual strictly historical focus to draw your attention to certain lessons from the past that are so relevant and existentially so for us today. Ever since Henry II, as King of England, Duke of Normandy and of Aquitaine, took control of Leinster and Munster in 1172 on the basis that he feared a rival Hiberno-Norman kingdom under Strongbow on England's western flank, Ireland assumed strategic value in English considerations. Almost 300 years later, England's Irish nightmare revived, when James, Earl of Desmond, and the envoys of King Francois I of France negotiated and concluded a treaty against England at Askeaton on the Shannon Estuary on the 23rd of June, 1523. This year is the 500th anniversary of that event, the first treaty that was signed by an Irish political heavyweight and a European power. And the interesting thing about this treaty is that it was not a case of an Irish lord seeking help from a continental power. It was instead the French who came courting Desmond for this alliance. France and Scotland were traditional allies against England, but this was not enough for the ambitious Francois I. In his grand designs to counter the Anglo-Spanish alliance at that time and its power over the sea route from the Baltic and the North Sea to the Atlantic, he recognized the strategic importance of Ireland, and thus he initiated negotiations with Desmond. And within 10 years, the French monarchy had also intrigued with Manus O'Donnell of Donegal in the formation of a Franco-Tyrconnell Scottish axis against Henry VIII. However, the French king was soon defeated and captured at Pavia by the Emperor Charles V in 1525, and so Desmond, feeling vulnerable at the tender mercies of the English and observing the growing rift between Henry VIII and his first queen consort, Catherine of Aragon, swiftly switched sides and dispatched his emissaries to the court of Catherine's nephew, Charles V, at Toledo. That culminated in the Treaty of Dingle on the 28th of April, 1529, signed between Desmond and the Emperor's personal envoy, plenipotentiary Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba. The ramifications of this treaty were far-reaching and most beneficial for generations of Irish émigrés to the Spanish and Austrian Habsburg territories throughout the following centuries, right down until 1952. For our purposes, this event set Ireland firmly in Spanish Habsburg strategic thinking concerning the security of trade and communications between Spain, Portugal, the Mediterranean, and Northern Europe. And there on this Spanish map, you see how Ireland is clearly defined, right north of this Biscayan region here, and the trading routes from the Mediterranean through the Straits of Gibraltar up along here to Lisbon and Porto and various ports along the north coast of Spain, as well as ports here along Gascony, Aquitaine, west coast of France, right around up into the Baltic trade, especially Baltic timber. And this is another consideration in Spanish thinking, how to secure the supplies of Baltic timber to Spain, which was quite short in supply of that. But also we must remember that at this time, taking up on the Pranny's recent exposition on food, you also have the Basque fishermen here knowing of the secrets of the shoals of herring and following them up along the west coast of Ireland all the way up towards Greenland and Newfoundland banks. And as we know from the documentary evidence of medieval Ireland, Irish lords such as the O'Sullivan Bear, for instance, or indeed the MacMahons and the O'Briens of Thomond, and the O'Malleys and O'Flahertys up here in Connacht, and the O'Donnells in Donegal, had granted licenses to Spanish fishermen, these Basques, these seafarers of the shoals of herring, that they could bring their catches from the Newfoundland banks ashore and smoke them or salt them and return them to the markets here in Spain and Portugal. It's not for nothing that the south coast of County Clare there along the Shannon estuary is called Curcha Boschken, the coastlands of the Basques. And recent studies on DNA from Trinity College Dublin show there's quite a high significance of Basque DNA up here along the Shannon estuary and other places indeed along the western coast. So bear these issues in mind: security of trade, security of fishing supplies between Northern Europe and Southern Europe, and control of the sea routes. And therefore Ireland assumes an importance as a bridgehead for the continental powers when England was dissociating itself from the continent, especially from Henry VIII's breach with Rome and with his allies in France and Spain subsequently. So keep that in mind. Suffice it to say that there had been limited Habsburg support for the Kildare Rebellion of 1534 to 36, but it was enough for Charles V to keep pressure on Henry VIII. Also, throughout the 1540s and 50s, the French and the Scottish intrigued with the lords of Ulster and Connaught against Henry VIII, Edward VI, and Mary I. For a brief period from 1553 to 1558, England and Ireland seemed safely within the Habsburg orbit with the marriage alliance of Mary and Philip and the restoration of Catholicism in both England and Ireland. Philip was King of Ireland at this time. Following Mary's death in 1558, Anglo-Spanish relations deteriorated from the late 1560s onwards, with English piracy on Spanish and Netherlandish fishing and trade, etc., and plundering the treasure fleets coming across the Atlantic as well. So Ireland assumes a new special significance in the strategic thinking, not just only of the Spanish, but also of the English. For at that time, there was an old expression, an old proverb: he who would England win must with Ireland begin. So 9 years before the Armada of 1588, Philip had joined Pope Gregory XIII in supporting the first counter-Reformation crusade in Ireland against Elizabeth I in 1579. That year, the Captain General of Desmond, James Fitzmaurice Fitzgerald, the papal legate for the Nicholas Sonder, and a Spanish royal observer, Fray Mateo de Oviedo, arrived in Dingle with a combined force of papal and Spanish troops under Colonel Bastiano di San Giuseppe. They had been transported to West Kerry by the Castilian Naval Squadron under Admiral Don Juan Martinez de Recalde. And it was Recalde who surveyed the Kerry coastline from the Shannon estuary to the Iveragh Peninsula, and his knowledge of it would prove most useful 9 years later in September of 1588, when he returned to these waters and rescued 2 ships. Ultimately, the Spanish Papal Irish forces at Carrigafoyle on the Shannon Estuary and at Dúnan Oir in West Kerry were defeated by a desperately scrambled English force. The Elizabethan regime considered the Second Desmond Rebellion from 1579 to 83 to be of such a great existential threat that it threw everything it had in terms of money, men, arms, and naval support, even withdrawing its supports for the Dutch Calvinist rebels and the ablest English veteran soldiers from the Netherlands to help reassert its control in southern Ireland. The English had become literally bogged down in 4 years of intensive warfare in southwestern Ireland, that their redeployment of resources away from the Dutch rebels greatly assisted Alessandro Farnese, Duke of Parma, in regaining lost grounds from the Dutch rebels in Flanders and Brabant, including the retaking of Antwerp on the 17th of August, 1585. Now, from the foregoing, we can appreciate that this North Atlantic island, however geographically distant from mainland Europe, held major strategic significance for the great powers of the 16th century, France and Spain, and it held existential strategic importance for the emerging power, England. Even in the aftermath of the defeat of Desmond in 1583, we can see just how determined the English were to hold on to this island and to prevent it from becoming a bridgehead for its enemies. The ruthless scorched earth policy, the massacres and the land clearances, followed by the plantation of English Protestant settlers in Munster, testify to terrified English concerns. The large number of refugees from Munster, known as the Geraldine exiles in A Coruña and Lisbon, and who became closely associated with Recalde's Galician and Atlantic squadrons, and indeed with the Marqués de Santa Cruz's expedition to Terceira in the Azores in 1583, further compounded English fears of a renewed Hiberno-Hispanic assault on Ireland. Significantly, it was Santa Cruz who first raised the idea with Philip II of sending an armada against England, and in a letter that he sent from Terceira on the 9th of August 1583, we know that he proposed taking Ireland first as the first step to taking England. And as we know, Santa Cruz was originally intended to command the Armada in the enterprise, but his untimely death proved a major setback. Had he lived, things might have turned out quite differently. But Santa Cruz was not alone among the Spanish strategists who advised Philip to focus his greater enterprise on Ireland instead of England. In June of 1586, the great navigational scientist, geographer, and political strategist on Anglo-Spanish affairs, Bernardino de Escalante, proposed taking Ireland first. And I quote him, "I would think it advisable to try and take the island of Ireland this summer, which would be of great importance, as it would not only oblige the Queen of England to withdraw her infantry in Holland and Zeeland, but would make matters in Flanders easier. It would also facilitate the conquest of England." In October 1586, Philip and Santa Cruz had proposed the idea to the Council of War of sending the Armada to Ireland first, where it would receive local support and become an effective base from which to invade England from the west and south, while Alessandro Farnese, the governor of the Habsburg Netherlands, would simultaneously attack England's southeast coast from Flanders. However, Palmer's advice that England rather than Ireland should be the primary objective prevailed. Yet, as late as the 28th of February 1587, the Secretary of the Council of State, Juan de Idiaquez, wrote to Medina Sidonia that if Ireland were occupied first, then it would be easier to defeat English piracy in the Atlantic, quote, at least take Ireland from her, referring to Elizabeth, so that it may serve as a stepping stone towards the English enterprise itself. Now, following the death of Santa Cruz on the 9th of February 1588, Philip continued with the project and he appointed the Duke of Medina Sidonia to command the Armada. And on the 29th of May that year, he assumed control. He was given the same secret instruction that Philip had sent his predecessor, that once Parma's German and Italian troops were landed in England, Medina Sidonia was to transport 1,000 Irish veterans in Parma's army to Ireland and secure it for Philip, and from there open a second front in Wales and the west of England. Ireland was intended to become a Spanish bridgehead into the west of England, and as we know, this did not happen as Medina Sidonia's fleet was caught up with the English fire ships and had to cut anchor and disperse into the North Sea, and of course the rest we all know what happened in September of that year. However, when we consider the hysterical reaction of Elizabeth's Lord Deputy in Ireland, Sir William Fitzwilliam, to news of Spaniards coming ashore on our north and west coasts, and the merciless bloodlust that he and his subordinates, Richard and George Bingham and Edward Denny, had unleashed upon them, we perceive yet again just how Ireland was of existential, strategic importance to its larger neighbour. What the foregoing tells us quite unequivocally is that Ireland was not a mere insignificant island on the periphery of Europe, but a strategically pivotal bridgehead for Spain in the 16th century. Later, for France, in the 17th and 18th centuries, Ireland would assume that strategic bridgehead importance. I'm just going to move on here a little bit. There are some of the regiments and tercios in Spain, the Irish ones in the Spanish services, from the 17th right through to the 19th centuries, and in France from 1690 onwards till 1792, the year of the great disaster for civilization, and from Austria right from 1635 until 1919, and in Bavaria from 1635 until 1919. So for England, having all of these Irish veteran troops in the Continental Army's powers throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, as well as trying to secure Ireland itself from the possibility of a foreign invasion with these troops, these veteran Irish troops, it became an absolute priority. Now let us turn the tide from the past strategic significance of Ireland to its present geopivotal importance in the considerations of our partners in Europe and our larger neighbouring island. It is most remarkable that since the foundation of the state of independent sovereign Ireland a century ago, successive Irish governments have not invested substantially in its national defence forces. In comparison to other European countries, Ireland spends only 0.27% of its gross domestic product, or GDP, on its national defence capabilities. Ireland has the unique distinction of having the lowest expenditure on its national security. Ireland's entire navy consists of 9 small ships, none of which are warships, nor are they suitable for deep-sea engagement. Its air corps consists of 8 types of craft, small planes and helicopters, none of which are equal to the aircraft used by our neighbours, never mind the major powers. We have no fighter jets. We have less than 10,000 active army personnel, and retention is a major problem due to the impoverished pay and conditions. Certainly, economic stringencies and limited state resources between the 1930s and 60s help explain the lack of a serious investment in national defence. As historians of independent Ireland, notably Michael Kennedy and Dermot Keogh, have demonstrated, we were lucky to have benefited from US and British naval and aerial protection during the Second World War. And as you can see there, Eamon de Valera, in Article 49 of the Irish Constitution of 22, he based his policy on that. Save in the case of actual invasion, the Irish Free State shall not be committed to active participation in any war without the assent of the Oireachtas. And during his tenure in power, during the 30s and 40s, he pursued the policy of official neutrality. But the reality, as we all know, is that it was partisan, in favour of the Allies, with the overflight of the Donegal-Leitrim corridor for Allied aircraft into the Atlantic during the Second World War, as well as the provision of weather reports to the Allied forces for the D-Day landings in Normandy of June 1944. During the Cold War, Ireland maintained official neutrality, while being ideologically opposed to communism. And since 1955, Ireland has permitted its defence forces to participate under the United Nations peacekeeping mandates. There are a number of incidents there. 1962, when the height of the Cold War, aircraft between the Warsaw Pact and Cuba were stopped over in Shannon Airport for refuelling, were subjected to searches by Irish security authorities for warlike material. Then in 1973, Ireland joined the EEC, the precursor of the EU. 1986, we ratified the Single European Act. 1992, we signed the Maastricht Treaty. And 2009, we ratified the Lisbon Treaty. And since September the 11th, 2001, we have permitted US air forces to stop over in Shannon Airport under the terms of the UN Security Council Resolution 1368, invoking the precedent of neutral Sweden, permitting the transit of German troops through its territory between Finland and Norway during World War II. That's our reality. We're politically not neutral. We're militarily neutral. During the late 60s, our Minister for Foreign Affairs, Frank Aiken, said, "We always valued the point of view of looking at each issue on its merits and making a judgment call. That has been the persistent policy of Ireland's involvement at the United Nations." And indeed, we have joined the EU and the UN in condemnation of Putin's belligerence and with the sanctions on Russia over Ukraine. During the 1960s, our Taoiseach Sean Lemass said in Dáil Éireann that Ireland was in full agreement with the values and objectives of NATO. What neutrality means, if it means anything, is non-membership of a military alliance, and that has evolved over time. Now, while Irish governmental policy continues to maintain military neutrality, it joined the Permanent Structured Cooperation, PESCO, which is part of the European Union's security and defence policies. We've also operated under UN mandates and training, instructors, and the NATO-led ISAF mission in Afghanistan, etc. And then, of course, our current leadership has made similar statements there again, to that point that we may be militarily neutral, but not politically. But let us look once again at the maps, bringing you back in time to the present. There you see the Russian naval exercises live fire in the Irish exclusive maritime economic zone prior to its invasion of Ukraine. And the inability of the under-resourced Irish Navy to deter the incursion and the token protest by Irish fishermen near the Russian flotilla exposed the vulnerability of neutral Ireland. There you see the flight paths of the Russian Air Force over Scandinavia and down through the North Atlantic around Ireland. And we all know why we are so strategically important in their considerations, because of the interconnecting cables connecting Europe and America, just off our shores. But also, if you look strategically at the maps, that's just the concerns of our neighbouring island again. Now, we do take pride in our neutrality, in non-belligerence, and it's interesting that in the recent opinion polls, yes, the majority want to retain neutrality, but significantly 59% of all who participated in the polls wanted to significantly increase military spending to enable Ireland to realistically defend its sovereignty and neutrality. Only 28% opposed the motion. Now, if you just bear with me, this is the traditional cartographic representation of the world, and many people think of Ireland's position in relation to the rest of the world. Here we are, a little Atlantic island out here, far away from the major centre of Eurasian engagements. Now, bear with me. Let's look at the geostrategic considerations, how we might perceive our geography. There we are. But if you look at us in terms of the Americas being in the center, Europe to one side and the Asian landmass to the other, we are quite strategically important. If you are a Russian naval fleet in Arkhangelsk, which has been invested heavily in by the Chinese, and they're coming down this way, a bridgehead here in the Atlantic could create a lot of trouble, not only for Europe, but for this area too, the United States. Look at the strategic straits for maritime trade. From here in the South China Sea, coming through the Straits of the Malaccas and up here through Hormuz, the Suez Canal, or around the Cape of Good Hope, up into Europe and to trade in the Atlantic region here, or even looking further east again across from Asia towards the western parts of the Americas. Traditionally, the European imperial powers, when they wanted to get control of a strait, would send in a marine force, gunboat diplomacy. The Chinese have been much cleverer. Over the last 20 years, they've been buying up properties along the straits. They own this straits here of the Malaccas. They own properties along the Suez Canal and the Straits of Hormuz. They have a naval base in Djibouti on the Horn of Africa. They're also busily buying up here around the Cape of Good Hope. And recently, the Spanish government objected to Britain allowing any sales of properties in the Straits of Gibraltar to the Chinese. Now look at another perspective on the world map. Here we are looking down from the North Pole's aspect. There's your Arctic Circle. Japan is over here. Ireland is here. Very close. Prior to the Ukraine war, you could fly from Europe, Northern Europe, to Japan within 12 hours. Now you have to go all the way through Abu Dhabi or Dubai or Qatar. It takes you nearly 22 to 23 hours. With the loosening of ice along parts of the Arctic Circle, the Chinese, who do not have territory on the Arctic Circle, the Chinese are interested in the possibilities of navigation, faster route to Europe. And that's why they've been busily investing in the Russian territory along the Arctic Circle. It's not that far from Greenland, Canada, and Alaska. And again, looking at the Arctic fleet from Russia coming down into the Atlantic here, yes, they come between Norway and Iceland, but look at Ireland, it's not in NATO, the others are. We're sitting ducks. Now, if you bear with me a little bit more, there you have the juxtaposition of the old Spanish map, and you can appreciate the tradition of Ireland's geostrategic pivotal position in the North Atlantic and for Northern Europe. Now, if you will bear with me, ever since 1945, Japan has adhered diligently to its national official policy of neutrality. This is my concluding point. Let us draw in a comparative example. For Ireland, Japan is an island nation. Like Ireland, geographically positioned off the coast of a great continent. Its nearest neighbours are two world powers, Russia and China, and a divided peninsular nation, South and North Korea, the latter a troublesome neighbour that frequently fires missiles into Japan's territory. While many think of Japan as being the historic aggressor towards its neighbours, particularly during the Second World War, what is often overlooked is that on 3 occasions in history, Imperial China attempted massive invasion attempts on Japan, most notably under the Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan in 1274 and in 1281. His massive armadas were assembled, involving Korean, Chinese, and Vietnamese fleets and soldiers, only to be driven back by storms, Japan's divine winds, the kamikaze. As I've said, Japan has adhered diligently to its national policy of pacifism and military neutrality since 1945. It merely maintained a small defense force that was supported by 0.4% of GDP. However, that has changed dramatically over the past 5 years due to the increasing rate of North Korean missile launches into Japanese territory and Chinese naval aggression in the region, and particularly after China's rejection of the International Court's ruling in 2016 that the Spratly Islands were Filipino sovereign territory. Russia's invasion of Ukraine galvanized the process of Japan's defense reforms, and in December of 2022, Japan announced its national security strategy that fundamentally reinforces its defense capabilities, including counter-strike actions, and the increase of its national defense budget to 2% of current GDP. By Christmas of last year, Japan signed contracts with Britain and with Italy for the latest in fighter jet technology, and I understand is currently seeking contracts with various shipbuilding nations, including Spain, particularly for military ships and their technology. Like other neutral countries, such as Austria and Sweden, Japan is taking its ability for defending itself very seriously. So now that our Taoiseach and Minister for Foreign Affairs and Defence, Micheál Martin, has initiated a public forum to discuss Ireland's neutrality under the chairpersonship of Louise Richardson, it is to be hoped that a brutally honest discussion about our need to invest seriously in national defence capabilities takes place. If we are to make progress in defending our sovereignty as well as our neutrality, as we have seen in this presentation, in the past, Ireland was regarded by the major world powers as a strategically pivotal bridgehead in the North Atlantic, and it continues to do so today. It was not without coincidence that Putin decided to send his Arctic fleet into our waters when we were celebrating the centenary of our independence. He was showing up our inability to defend our sovereignty, never mind our neutrality. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Declan Downey. Fascinating as always. So I woke up this morning without a care in the world. I don't think I'll be able to sleep tonight. Our final lecture, a dual presentation by members of the Spanish Ministry of Culture. In light of work relating to the 2001 UNESCO Convention and speaking today on Spanish underwater cultural heritage, please welcome Carmen Cabrera and Paloma Sanchez.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the Spanish Armada TIDE International Conference for inviting the Spanish Ministry of Culture to participate in it. I would also like to thank the Spanish Embassy in Ireland and the National Monument Service of the Government of Ireland for the intermediation and coordination so that our presence here was possible. The truth is that it is an honor and a pleasure for us to be here in Sligo, experiencing firsthand these ties that link Spain and Ireland through history and a shared heritage, such as the underwater cultural heritage, more precisely, that of the wrecks of the Spanish Armada in Ireland. In our presentation, my colleague Paloma and I would like to show the work carried out by Spain in the field of underwater cultural heritage, a work that for more than 2 decades has been especially boosted and enhanced with the ratification in 2005 of the UNESCO Convention for the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage. Today, it can be said that Spain is one of the countries that with more strength and preeminence defends the protection of this heritage and has proven to be a power in research, methodology, technical means, archaeological expertise, conservation of collections, and museology of this type of heritage. First, I will begin by giving a brief outline of the 2001 Convention, its main objectives and principles, and then focus on the Spanish case, the good practices we have been registering within the framework of this Convention, and the main international projects currently underway. Then my colleague Paloma will explain our work from the National Plan of Underwater Archaeology, the role of the National Center, ARQUA, and the regional centers of underwater archaeology, and the main projects and line of work currently underway at the national level. Well, the 2001 Convention is the international agreement specifically dedicated to the protection of underwater cultural heritage. May I refer to this term onwards as UCH, to shorten the term. The Convention recognizes UCH as part of the cultural heritage of humanity. It offers a legislative framework for the protection and cooperation between its states parties, and it is complementary to the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and the 1970 Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property. But until the entry into force of the Convention, there was no international standard that protected this matter. UCH is a clear attraction for looting and plundering, since priceless species can be found on the seabed, which, in the absence of regulations to protect them, would encourage many people and even companies to seek to profit from them. On the high seas, there is no other legal power, state legal power, than that which applies to vessels and nationals of a state. Recognizing so the urgent need for an international legal instrument to regulate and coordinate the protection of underwater archaeological sites and to encourage cooperation between states, the Convention was adopted at the General Conference of UNESCO in 2001. It only entered into force in 2009, after being ratified by 20 states parties, as stated in its Article 27. To date, 71 states have ratified the Convention. As far as Spain is concerned, it should be noted its active participation in the drafting of the Convention, being one of the first countries to ratify it. Spain is also playing a relevant role nowadays in the regional forums organized by UNESCO to encourage other states to ratify the Convention. UCH is defined in this Convention as all traces of human existence of a cultural, historical, or archaeological nature which, for at least 100 years, have been partially or totally immersed, periodically or permanently, under the oceans and in lakes and rivers, such as sites, old buildings and structures, vessels and aircrafts with its load, archaeological objects and human remains together with its archaeological and natural context. UCH faces multiple threats such as treasure hunts, looting and commercial exploitation. Environmental degradation also endangers its preservation, in addition to technological advances that drive coastal development and exploitation of marine resources. Thus, the 2001 Convention is fully in line with the Sustainable Development Objectives defined in the 2030 United Nations Agenda. The Convention consists of a preamble setting out the philosophy and spirit of the text, a set of 33 articles, and an annex with 36 rules that Article 33 of the Convention qualifies as an integral part of it. The Convention establishes the general framework for action based on a series of basic principles that must be respected by all. Prohibition of commercial exploitation, protection and fight against commercialization of found objects. The Convention contains obligation on the prevention of commercial exploitation, looting and traffic of UCH, allowing the application of sanctions or seizures by states parties. Article 22 of the Convention underlines as well the importance of the implementation of competent services by states parties to protect UCH. The implementation of inventories is as well a key question for the management of this heritage, and is really useful and necessary because we cannot protect what we don't know. The in situ preservation is the first option before authorizing and undertaking any intervention on this heritage. The recovery of objects may, however, be authorized when it contributes significantly to the protection or knowledge of this heritage. Objects that are endangered or need to be researched or exhibited in a museum may be recovered under the 2001 Convention in order to enable their better preservation for future generations. Similarly, the 2001 Convention requires that all human remains dumped in maritime waters be given due respect. The Convention also encourages responsible and non-detrimental public access to in situ UCH for observation or documentation purposes to promote public awareness, recognition, and protection, unless such access is incompatible with its protection and management. A big principle is international cooperation. The states parties to the Convention shall cooperate and assist each other in the protection and management of UCH, in particular by sharing information. As per Article 6 states parties shall be encouraged to conclude bilateral, regional, or other multilateral agreements, or to develop existing agreements for the purpose of preserving UCH. Capacity building and information exchange. States parties should encourage training in underwater archaeology, technology transfer, and information sharing, and public awareness of the value and significance of this heritage. The annex of the 2001 Convention is an integral part of it and contains rules for activities directed at UCH. They are a reference in the field of underwater excavation and archaeology, setting the rules for the responsible management of this cultural heritage. These rules include principles of project design, guidelines for the skills and qualifications required of persons undertaking these interventions, information on the organization of financing for excavation projects, guidelines for excavation documentation, and conservation and site management methodologies. But if there is something relevant in the 2001 Convention, it is the protection of UCH in the different marine areas. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea defines maritime boundaries, including beyond national jurisdiction. In accordance with this, the regulation by maritime zones allows the 2001 Convention to provide and improve cooperation between states parties. In their inland waters, archipelagic waters, and territorial sea, states have the exclusive right to regulate and authorize activities directed at UCH present in these places. But when it comes to objects found in the exclusive economic zone or on the continental shelf, it is not so simple. It requires negotiation and collaboration among all the states concerned, albeit with the coordination of the coastal state concerned. States parties to the Convention decided in 2015 to implement a register of best practices. These projects are assessed by the Scientific and Technical Advisory Body to the Convention, which makes recommendations to the meeting of states parties regarding their designation. The exchange of best practices provides states parties with specific answers to the different challenges of protecting and promoting underwater heritage. The best practice designated by the Conference of States Parties upon recommendation of the staff receive a label with the logo of the 2001 Convention in order to promote their visibility to the general public. This designation thus has many advantages. It increases the visibility of the site or the institution concerning, for example, an underwater museum. It encourages other states parties to follow this best practices example by adopting similar protection and management measures. It promotes responsible access to underwater cultural heritage, and it allows actors in charge of heritage and whose activities have been recognized as best practices to network and cooperate through joint activities, scientific exchanges, joint temporary exhibitions, for example. Spain is the country To date, the country with the highest number of best practices inscribed in this register, 6 practices. You can see in the slide all the projects we have been registering since 2017. Now we are willing to inscribe a new project in the list, in this register, which is the exhibition, The Fleet of New Spain and the Search for the Vessel Nuestra Señora del Juncal. This exhibition took place between 2021 and 2022, and it is a project. This project is part of a memorandum of understanding between Spain and Mexico, signed in 2014 for cooperation in the identification, management, research, and preservation of UCH resources and sites, whose main objective is the study of the New Spain fleet of 1630-1631, and particularly of its 2 flagships, the Santa Teresa and the Nuestra Señora del Juncal. As a result of this agreement, of this cooperation, this exhibition seeks to bring closer to the public research work carried out to date, both in the archives and in the survey campaigns. The curators, both from Mexico and Spain, reveal the history of this vessel, sunk in 1631 due to a storm off the coast of Campeche, Mexico. At the same time of its sinking, on its way from Veracruz to Spain, it was loaded with a large quantity of silver in coins and ingots, as well as products of high value in the European market, such as grana, indigo, silk, and cocoa. The exhibition was first held at the General Archive of the Indies in Seville, and was afterwards also being shown in a reduced format in the Museum of America in Madrid. The idea is that now it can be displayed in Mexico in a near future. In any case, a virtual tour of the exhibition has also been recorded and it is available on the website of the Ministry of Culture, so that together with the catalogue, it has been possible to remain a permanent testimony of the magnificent exhibition and research work carried out. It has been the largest and most visited exhibition to date at the General Archive of the Indies in Seville, with more than 80,000 visitors in 4 months. And it is an example of how the UCH can be investigated and made known without even having been through an excavation. In this next section, dedicated to international cooperation, I will explain some of the most relevant ongoing projects within the framework of the protection of UCH, in which Spain is participating, both at the multilateral level, such as the case of the Esquerque Bank's mission, as well as other bilateral collaborations with non-signatory countries. The project for the protection of UCH of the Esquerque Bank is the first example of multilateral cooperation as foreseen by the 2001 Convention, Articles 9 and 10. The Esquerque Bank is located in the Strait of Sicily, Canal du Cap Bon, along one of the busiest maritime routes in the Mediterranean. However, it's also one of the most risky ones. Vessels from different ages, running from Roman shipwrecks to vessels of the First and Second World War, lie on this site. The fragility of the heritage of the Esquerque banks was notified to UNESCO by Italy at the beginning of 2018. Thereupon, 8 states parties to the 2001 Convention from both shores of the Mediterranean Sea, Algeria, Croatia, Egypt, France, Morocco, Spain, and Tunisia, together with Italy, expressed their interest in being consulted and join forces on ways to ensure the effective protection of the heritage of this site, as provided for in the 2001 Convention. A coordinating committee composed of the involved states parties has been established to support the initiative. Each state is represented by a designated focal point within a relevant department. The coordination committee is responsible for developing strategies and action plans to achieve the objectives of the initiative. In 2022, researchers from the 8 stakeholders states drove, under the support of UNESCO, a successful in situ archaeological mission. It took place over 14 days aboard the French scientific vessel, the Alfred Merlin, in international waters on the Italian and Tunisian continental shelves, under the respective coordination of Italy and Tunisia, as per Article 10 of the Convention. Spain participated in this mission, both giving expertise and financial support. The establishment of this cooperation mechanism represents a real opportunity for these Mediterranean states and the region to protect an underwater heritage beyond their territorial seas. For the first time, international scientists have modeled the shipwrecks and improved the mapping of the area in order to protect important UCH in the long term. Regarding the collaboration with no signing countries, we have to say that USA is a key country for cooperation in UCH. The east coast of the United States, mainly Florida, is an area that is home to the remains of old Spanish galleons, probably hundreds of wrecks, on which the treasure hunter companies have their eyes, resources, and technology focused. Since years, Spain works towards closer collaboration with the USA, a country that is not a signatory to the 2001 Convention, and has therefore recently renewed 2 agreements with American governmental institutions, the U.S. National Park Service and the National Atmospheric Administration. The objective of this agreement is to facilitate and improve programs and projects related to the historical and underwater heritage shared by Spain and the United States, with particular reference to the sites and programs of the National Park Service associated to this heritage. This year, representatives of the Ministry of Culture of Spain traveled twice to Washington and Florida with the aim of renewing and reinforcing this collaboration. Particularly in the case of Florida, we are working directly with the City Council of San Agustin to organize an exhibition there at the end of 2024. Sorry, because we are very bad of time, and I want my colleague Paloma to explain the national plans. I had more things to talk about the international cooperation, but I think it's more important to hear her about the national plan.
Yes. Well, we are going to pass through this all this international. We want to talk about the collaboration in process with Ireland. We think it's important, but we have to talk in another time about this. So, regarding the national plan, our national plan of the protection of underwater archaeological heritage was approved in 2007. It's the first plan we have approved in Spain. This is the main points. You can see here all the main points are inside this plan. The legal protection of the Spanish underwater archaeological sites. One of the main points is the development of archaeological maps in the Spanish waters, and the strength with ARQUA, the National Museum, and of course the Regional Museum. We are now doing some training and capacity building programs, especially with the task forces and the Spanish Navy. And we are cooperating strongly with the Foreign Affairs Administration. We have our colleagues here, Carlos, through these 2 tools, the Scientific Committee and the Interministerial Committee. Yes, this is the underwater archaeology centers we have in Spain. The national one is in Cartagena, in Murcia, and the 3 regionals in Catalonia, Cádiz, and Valencia. This is the National Museum of Underwater Archaeology. It's reinaugurated in 2008. Is the main institution of the conservation, the protection, and the exhibition of this underwater cultural heritage in Spain. We would love to show you this. The Arquatec is the laboratory we have to the preservation of this heritage, this very difficult to preserve heritage. I think you already know. We have one of the Europe's cutting-edge facilities competent to respond any problems that might arise anywhere in the country regarding underwater cultural heritage. This laboratory is collaborating with some regional communities in Spain. Here you can see a photograph of one of the spaces of this laboratory. It's 1,000 square meters, so it's very, very big. It have structures for treatments as lyophilization, freeze dryer, desalinization, impregnation, electrolysis, and washing tables, cranes, and all kind of equipment. Here you can see here is in this tank there is a very large canyon. It's amazing. And here you can see some of the equipment we have. This is the machine created to identify the Mercedes coins. This is the amphorarium. It's amazing. I think Carlos knows better these installations. We had the lyophilization process, a freeze dryer. This is a more picture of the lyophilization process. Some cleaning of the Mercedes gun or the coins. We are now in the process to clean these coins. They are enormous, many coins. And the restoration of Phoenician amphora, because we have a lot of materials for the ancient times, and the electrolysis process. And we have to, well, this is going to be very, very fast, but the projects we have now in mind at the Mazarrón 2, it's a Phoenician shipwreck, we have to lift off this ship because it's in risk of destruction for the climate change. It's a very, very big project we are now in collaboration with the regional government of Murcia. And of course, the training courses with the Navy, Guardia Civil, National Police. We are celebrating one this year. And I forgot to include the slide, but we are now creating a new group, new team of underwater archaeologists. We are now 6 new archaeologists, so we are very happy. And the project for the inland waters, because they have a lot of heritage has emerged in the inland waters from the drought in the rivers and water reservoirs. So sorry, because it was a very, very fast presentation, but in these slides, I think you can see how we can work with Ireland government. We are very excited to work with you. So these are more examples to join collaboration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin. Take a seat there. So just before we conclude this morning, and thanks to Carmen and Paloma for their talk, we've maybe got 10 minutes before we break for lunch. If anybody has any questions, so Declan is going to moderate the discussion and to take the questions on behalf of and to direct them to the relevant person. We have 2 microphones roving. Michael has one on this side. Declan has one on the other side. If you'd like to ask a question, just raise your hand and one or other of the guests, or one or other of the lads will make their way over to you. So any questions, please?
In terms of defence?
It's up to our government to decide on whether it's going to collaborate with Sweden or Norway or Iceland, indeed, or our neighbouring island, or France or Spain with regards to defence in the North Atlantic. I can't answer that question. It's up to the government.
We lost our Spanish fleet. Fishing to the Spanish fleet, so we should see collaboration there in terms of restoration of some employment on our western seaboard.
Well, all I can say is this. There was a lot of publicity recently about the 2 decommissioned gunboats from New Zealand that were brought on a Dutch cargo ship into Cove last week. We should have invested in 2 proper warships from Spain, purpose-built. Spain is the leading country in the world for building naval fleets. And that's where we should have gone, instead of wasting taxpayers' money on 2 decommissioned gunboats. It reminds me of the story of the L.E. Marahu. Have you heard that? Back in 1939, on the eve of the Second World War, De Valera decided maybe we do need to have some form of naval protection to patrol the coast. So they bought the decommissioned British gunboat, the Helga. Does that ring a bell? The irony being that it was the Helga that bombarded the GPO in 1916. You couldn't make it up. Anyhow, there was the great De Valera. He bought the Helga, painted it green, and called it the L.E. Marahu, Linga Éireann Marahu, the Irish ship, the Seawolf. And it was sent on its maiden voyage up to Carlingford Lough to show the flag to the Unionists in Northern Ireland. And a Norwegian fishing vessel came into Irish territorial waters, and the instruction came through to the gunboat, fire a shot across their bows, let them know they're in Irish waters. So the shot was fired. The gun ricocheted back in through the deck. The L.E. Marahu took water, and the Norwegians towed them into Dundalk. Now, I'm conscious of my fact here. I'm just merely sharing this discussion, and I have no intention of dominating the discussion. So there are a number of fascinating papers that we have heard this morning, and I'm sure you all have something to ask of the other participants here. Yes.
Thanks, Michal. Martin Enright, originally from Dingle, and I can remember very, very well May of 1968 when Dr. Colm Arton and his team were going to bring up great treasures from the Blasket Sound. As a young teenager, I had been over and back the Sound many times, and we never ever still go through the Blasket Sound without thinking of the ghosts of the Spanish Armada. And I know he had a wonderful time in Dingle at that time, but there was one man in particular in Dunquin, and he had browner skin than anybody else. He really did look very Spanish. Now, the DNA tells us there's no Spanish Armada blood in the Irish mainstream, but has anything changed in that thinking? And I mean, also, it's 55 years since May of 1968. Isn't he looking well?
Thank you. Well, the greatest treasure we found in Blasket Sound was no treasure at all, because had we found treasure, I cannot imagine, or I can imagine with horror, what might have transpired from that. But the treasure we found was a number of questions about the Armada, questions which hadn't really arisen before. Things like that the Armada was supposed to have run out of shot, and that was its downfall. Not so, because on the Santa Maria la Rosa, we found hundreds and hundreds of pieces of unspent shot, and that set us into thinking about why that was so. And as I say, it was a wonderful apprenticeship and a wonderful place to work in Dingle in 1968.
I apologise for this question, but I always was of the belief that the Sassani invaded Ireland and took the wood to build their ships. Am I correct in that assumption?
The English certainly used Irish oak, but it was in the 18th and 19th centuries but particularly in the 18th century, that you have the felling of Irish oak forests for building the English fleet. The process would have begun under Cromwell after 1653, but it accelerated in the 18th century, and particularly during the Napoleonic Wars. That's the time when Nelson appears on the scene, and that's the period when the British Navy really came into its great strength and own. And that's coterminous with the felling of our great oak forests. Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay.
It's not so much a question, more to those who may not have seen yesterday evening, and just to acknowledge, because it couldn't go unacknowledged, the hand of friendship, of cooperation reached out by our Spanish colleagues as we offer our hand of friendship and cooperation to you. And on behalf of us all here in the Heritage Services in the Government of Ireland, we look forward very much to working with you in the years ahead in terms of the Spanish Armada heritage here in Sligo and elsewhere. That's just for those who did not see the proceedings last night. So thank you, Paloma and Karen.
Have we any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm here, but I have a question. Have you ever found human remains in the Armada ships, in any Armada ships? Anywhere? Any of the shipwrecks? There are founded human remains?
Well, first,
Well,
would you like to take it first?
yes, please, wherever it is.
Colin might have something to say on that, I'd say, but in our work on any amount of work we've done on Trinidad, or the electricity that we haven't encountered human beings. Colin, it doesn't mean that they're not there. It depends on
as far as I'm aware,
it's oxidized.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Colin. No.
The only human remains we found relating to the Armada was a small part of a human skull on the Trinidad Valancera, and that we delivered through Lawrence Flanagan to the small collection of material from the Santa Maria that is now in the Ulster Museum for historical reasons which we needn't go into. I would say, though, that on another wreck, a Cromwellian warship, which was lost off the island of Mull in the Hebrides in 1653, we found not only examples of human bones, but the major part of a complete skeleton scattered widely throughout the wreck site. It turned out in the end that they all came from the same individual. That individual was studied very carefully by Professor Sue Black, a very noted forensic anthropologist, and she, with other experts doing specialist aspects of the study, wrote a remarkable biography, really, of this individual. We could tell a great deal about his origins, the fact that he was a young man, that he'd been to sea for a long time, and he had slight distortions to do with working on board a ship. Once that had been completed and is now published in a report, those remains were gathered together and we buried them as he was almost certainly a Protestant, with the local Protestant pastor doing a modified burial service in the grounds of Jewett Castle, which the ship had been attacking in 1653. And by good fortune, there was a consecrated, small piece of consecrated ground outside the castle, which had been set aside for the Hanoverian garrison in the 18th century. And there his remains were reverently buried. And we felt that that was the right thing. We got the information. It was all respectful. Indeed, once we realized we were dealing with an individual, we sort of felt his presence whenever we were working on the site. and it was a friendly presence. And that is how I think you should deal with human remains, whatever age. I don't really like it when prehistoric human remains are exhibited in a museum. I would like to see them buried. We don't know what rituals we should use, but we should be respectful at all times.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Yes. Sorry, could we just wait for the microphone? Yes.
Hi. I just wanted to ask you if there is plan to do further archaeological excavations in Amsterdam to find more things there.
Chief Archaeologist Michael McDonough said at the gathering yesterday that we do hope to undertake further investigations, initially through geophysical surveys, and we'd have to time those in such a way that they would be strategically undertaken to maximise the potential return we get from them. So, for example, we know that after winter storms, material can become exposed, so that might be a good time to undertake a geophysical survey. We'd also see it maybe as something that could be done over a period of a year or two to see how the site changes, the dynamics at work at the seabed, and then that might help us in developing a management strategy for the site and to identify areas that are vulnerable, where material might need to be recovered, or where we could do targeted investigations to understand the site better. So we have a commitment to continue our work at Strida and to try and get a better understanding of what's taking place there. And that's definitely on the agenda.
We have one other question then.
I have a question for Carmen and Pamela, if you don't mind. As you probably have heard, the Italian government is trying again to build a bridge through the Messina Canal. This is a politically very charged topic and pretty much a vanity project. From a biology point of view, given the high seismic nature of the land and the very strong currents, is, well, I would like to say madness, but let's say technically very difficult. And obviously, as we have seen even in your pictures, there's an awful lot of archaeology down there. Does the agreement protect this area in any way?
Yes, I think in many ways, yes, because this campaign, Sketchy Banks projects in the Sicily Channel, has made, because there were planned some works and construction works in the area. Also, the installation of the cables and other infrastructure. So this is a way to see what really are in this area, archaeologically speaking, and try to protect it. So this is one of the objectives of this project.
So, at this point, ladies and gentlemen, cognizant of the time, and the chef is anxious to serve you lunch, so I think you'll all agree we've had a fascinating range of topics covered this morning by a wonderful group of people who have given their expertise and their knowledge so generously to presenting their various aspects of study concerning the Armada to you. And I think you'll all agree that we have had an absolutely riveting morning. So, on behalf of all my fellow speakers at this table, I should like to express our deepest gratitude to the organizers of this conference, and particularly to Eddie O'Gorman and Micheál O'Donnell and their wonderful team, for their warm hospitality, their generosity, and welcome here to Sligo. And it's always good to be back here in this majestic county to enjoy its varied enchantments. And on that point of enchantment, I'd just like to say something in relation to Prani's paper, which was absolutely fascinating. And it has a relevance. Prani mentioned how tea and coffee were unknown in England at the time of the Armada. True, but tea was known in Dunboy Castle in the south of Ireland, because the archaeological excavations at Dunboy revealed that prior to the bombardment of Dunboy in 1601 by the English, the porcelain from the Orient and the fragments that they found there had contained spices such as ginger, but also tea. And it just shows again how the cultural closeness of West and Southern Ireland was to continental Europe. I might also add another little piece of information to you. How many of you have had toast and marmalade with your tea, coffee, or hot chocolate at breakfast this morning? Hands up. Yes, quite a few of you. You are familiar with these products on the breakfast table. Did you know that 365 years ago, these products arrived on the Irish and English breakfast tables thanks to the marriage of Charles II to Catherine of Bragança. The Portuguese Infanta brought these products to the breakfast table of these islands and popularized them. But who was the one who negotiated and organized the marriage? Dominic Daniel O'Daly, an Irish Dominican from Kilsarkin in County Kerry, who was the effective foreign minister of Portugal under the restored Bragantian monarchy. 1660. There you are. So, on that happy note of Irish culinary superiority to the neighbouring island, I bid you all bon appétit.
Thank you very much, Declan. And sorry, just before we let you go, just a great thanks once again to our speakers this morning, to Finbar Moore, to Prani Rattigan, to Pedro Luis Chinchilla, Declan Downey, Carmen Cabrera, Paloma Sanchez, and Colin Martin. Please show your appreciation to the board. And a very final word before we break for lunch. Just a reminder for delegates and indeed for members of the public who might be coming to our events later on. This evening we have Canon in C, which is a musical performance which is taking place at the Model, which is located just up the road. Delegates, you'll be brought by bus, but if you as members of the public have tickets for that, we'd ask you to be present at 6 o'clock. Doors open. The performance will start at 6:45 sharp, and it'll take us around 15 minutes to get people in the door. So 6 o'clock or thereabouts, if you could make your way there. If you don't have tickets, unfortunately, the event is now completely full. So hard luck. It's going to be great. And then tomorrow, again, if you have tickets for the lecture series, which will take place back here, it's exactly the same timetable. Doors open at 9 a.m. 9:30, the first lectures will start, bringing us right the way up until 1 o'clock. We've got a really interesting programme of events and lectures tomorrow morning. We'll take you in a slightly different direction, perhaps. So we'll have plenty of Armada and other maritime themes being explored right enough. But in addition to that, we're going to bring through areas such as virtual and augmented reality and how we engage with those, with digital technologies essentially, and how we retell stories relating to the Armada and other maritime themes. And we've some great examples of those kinds of presentations and how they manage to work within, say, a museum or a visitor experience in the modern day. And I think that's going to interest a lot of people who are sort of involved in how to develop tourism and experiences more generally for the visitors. We're also going to have some interesting other themes that are going to be explored, including there's one very interesting lecture coming up on Grace O'Malley, Grania Whale, the Pirate Queen from Mayo, who was actually alive during the time of the Armada. And one that I'm really interested in as an O'Donnell is we've got a presentation from Pedro O'Donnell, who's my long-lost cousin from Portugal, who's coming to speak tomorrow about the O'Donnells. So post-flight of the Earls, what happened once the Irish went to Spain, where they ended up. It's an absolutely fascinating insight. Again, if you don't have a ticket, you're going to have to watch those online. So thank you, everybody, for coming here today. The delegates, anybody who has received a meal voucher or who has one of these tags, can make your way into the room next door for lunch. Everybody else, we wish you safe travels back home, and thank you all for being here today. Gurmalbe.
Guys, can I just ask the TIDE project partners just to hang around for 5 minutes? We're meeting with Katrina from Ernact. So the TIDE project partners, if they could just remain here in the room for an extra 5 minutes. Thank you.